Smooth. That is the first thing. Smooth in a way that clay almost never is after 25 centuries, because the Athenian potters of the Kerameikos district understood something about fired terracotta that their contemporaries in Corinth and Argos were still working out. That the clay of the Attic plain, pulled from the riverbanks of the Ilissos, was finer grained than almost anything else available in the eastern Mediterranean, and that if you levigated it correctly, if you let it settle in water long enough that the coarser particles sank and the silts rose, what you were left with was something that, when fired at the right temperature in a kiln that you'd spent a generation learning to read, would come out of flames with a surface so uniform, so close-grained and dense, that 2,500 years of burial in attic soil would leave it feeling, to the fingers, like the inside of a well-worn leather shoe. Pick it up. The weight surprises you. It is heavier than you expect, because the wall of the vessel is thicker at the base than it appears, tapering toward the rim with precision that was not accidental. The two horizontal handles extend symmetrically from the sides, not the chunky, practical handles of storage jar, but thin, elegant, almost architecture extensions, the kind of handles designed to be held with a certain deliberateness, with a certain awareness that you are holding something made to be admired in the act of being used. This is a kylix, a shallow, wide-mouthed drinking cup, the preferred vessel of the Athenian symposium, the formal drinking party that was, in the Athens of the late 5th century BC, simultaneously a social ritual, a philosophical forum, a competitive performance space, and the primary arena in which Athenian elite identity was constructed and displayed. The kylix was not the largest cup at the symposium. It was the most important one. It demanded attention. Its shallow bowl meant you could not drink from it quickly or carelessly. You had to tilt it slowly, maintain a controlled angle, be aware of the liquid inside. It rewarded composure. It punished haste. This particular one was fired in approximately 414 BC. That date has a weight of its own, though we will get to that. For now, hold the object. Run your thumb along the interior of the bowl. With a black slip, that extraordinary Athenian ceramic coating, not technically a glaze, but a refined clay slip fired in a 3-stage oxygen reduction process that potters of the Kerameikos had developed and closely guarded for generations, covers the surface in a deep, lightless matte black, not reflective, not glossy, absorbing, the kind of black that seems to exist at a depth slightly below the surface of the clay itself, as if the darkness were a quality of the material rather than something applied to it. The exterior of the bowl is a natural color of the attic clay underneath, a warm, slightly orange-tinted red, the precise shade of a terracotta roof tile in afternoon light. This color alternation, interior black, exterior red, with the painted figures rendered in that same red against the black in the interior and the thin lines of added white for detail, is what art historians call the red figure technique. It was invented in Athens around 530 BC, almost certainly in the workshop of a potter we know by the name Endosides, and it spread across the Greek world within a generation because it allowed the painter to render the human body with a flexibility and a subtlety that the older black figure technique simply could not achieve. The painter of this kylix, we do not know his name, which is not unusual. Fewer than 1 in 10 Athenian vase painters signed their work, was competent, not a master. The figure in the interior of the bowl, the figure you see when you tilt the cup back and the dark wine inside begins to clear, is not the work of the Achilles painter or the Cleophon painter, the great names of that generation. It is good work, careful work, the kind that would sell reliably to the upper middle tier of the Athenian symposium market. The figure is a warrior. He stands in a relaxed contrapposto, weight shifted to his right leg, the left bent slightly at the knee. His body is rendered with attention to musculature, the pectorals defined, the abdomen articulated, the arms carrying the lean, functional mass of a man who does physical work, but is not a laborer. On his head, pushed back from his face so that the viewer can see his features, is a Corinthian helmet, the enclosed, bronze face type with the nasal guard and the cheek plates that frame the face like a parenthesis. The crest of the helmet is elaborate. The cloak draped over his left shoulder is short, ending at the hip, and the painter has used added red, a slip applied over black background before the final firing, to indicate its color. Crimson. Below the figure, in careful letters that curve slightly to follow the interior bottom of the bowl, is a single word, Lakedaimonios, a Lacedaemonian, the ancient term for a citizen of the city-state the rest of the world would come to call by a shorter name, Sparta. Now, hold that image. Hold the figure on the cup, the perfect posture, the idealized body, the crimson cloak, the leisurely heroic pose. And consider one fact, just one, before we go any further. The man who painted this figure had never been to Sparta. This is not speculation. In 414 BC, Athens and Sparta were in the 16th year of a war so total, so consuming, so geographically comprehensive that it would eventually hollow out the entire Greek world. The war that Thucydides of Athens, who lived through it, called the greatest disturbance in the history of the Greeks, and perhaps a significant part of humanity. In that year, in 414 BC, an Athenian potter moving through the streets of the Kylix district, passing the workshops and the clay pits and the drying sheds of the most productive ceramic industry in the ancient Mediterranean, was not the kind of man who took a trip to the Peloponnese. He would have been watched. He might have been killed. Sparta, the actual city in the actual valley of the Eurotas River, 210 kilometers to the southwest as the crow flies, was as inaccessible to this man as the moon. He painted what he had heard. He painted what had been told, or what had seen painted on other cups by other painters who had also never been there, a chain of copies of descriptions that reach back, probably, to some traveler's account, some returned diplomat's impressions, some fragment of oral tradition that had passed through so many mouths that had been smooth of all its inconvenient roughness. The way a stone is smoothed by a river, not made more accurate by the journey, but made more beautiful. The man who drank from this cup, the symposiast reclining on his klein in some well-appointed room in the Kylix or the Kolonos district, the lamplight catching the painted figure as he tilted the bowl back, had also never been to Sparta. He had probably never spoken to a Spartan. He knew Sparta the way most Athenians of his generation knew it. Through rumor, through the speeches of politicians, through the tragedies performed at the Dionysia festival, through the conversations of his peers, at exactly the kind of gathering at which he was now drinking from this cup. What he saw in the bowl was a mirror of a desire, not Sparta. The desire for a Sparta that was clean and legible and heroic and simple. A Sparta that could be reduced to figure. One figure, one posture, one crimson cloak, and inscribed with a single word, and understood completely in the few seconds before the wine covered it again. Sit with that for a moment, because that cup, that small, beautifully made, entirely fictitious portrait of a people, is not an anomaly. It is not an early mistake that later, more rigorous observers would correct. It is, instead, the founding document of a tradition of inventing Sparta from a distance, with great confidence and great aesthetic care, that would run continuously from the kills of the Kylix in 414 BC, through the philosophical academies of the 4th century, through the Roman Stoic schools, through the courts of Renaissance city-states and the salons of Enlightenment Europe, and the lecture halls of 19th century German universities, all the way to the present day, where the image on the cup, that posture, that cloak, that single identifying word, has become a logo, has become a brand, has become something people put on their arms in permanent ink, not knowing that what they are marking themselves with is not history. It is the echo of a portrait, painted by a man who had never left Athens. This cup is older than the story I want to tell you tonight. It was not made in the brutal valleys of the Peloponnese. The hands that shaped it were not Spartan hands. The eyes that admired it had never looked out from the high limestone ridges of Mount Taygetos at the long, fertile plain below, had never felt the specific quality of cold that settles into that valley in February, had never seen, with their own eyes, what a Spartan city actually looked like, which, as it happens, would have surprised them considerably. But it is, in its quiet way, an ambassador for it. Because what it shows us, before we say another word about the research, before we name a single scholar or cite a single excavation or examine a single grave site, what it shows us right now in the waiter in your hand and the figure inside it and the single word beneath the figure is this: the most enduring stories about a people are almost always invented by their enemies or their admirers, entirely from a distance. And the question of what those stories cost, what they cost the people they describe, what they cost us, what they are still costing us, is a question we're going to spend the next several hours quietly, carefully, honestly trying to answer. You can let the cup go now. Let it settle. Let your hands fall open, palms upward, the way hands fall when they're no longer needed for anything. Feel the weight of the blanket or the bed or whatever surface is holding you right now. Feel how completely it holds you. You do not have to assist it. It has been doing this without your help for some time. Let your jaw go soft. Let the space behind your eyes go dark. The past is not going anywhere. It has been waiting undisturbed for 2,500 years. It will wait a little longer, or it will come to you now, gently, the way deep water rises, not rushing, not demanding, simply present beneath whatever the day left behind. Breathe out. The kills of the Kylix are cold. The valley of the Eurotas is quiet, and there is nothing required of you tonight except to listen. There is a term used in classical scholarship that does not appear in many popular histories, because popular histories tend to prefer certainty of precision, and this term is, above all else, a precision tool. The term is le mirage spartiate, the Spartan mirage. It was coined in those exact words, in French, because the scholar who named it was French, and we will meet him properly in a little while, to describe a specific, documentable, academically verifiable phenomenon. The gap between the Sparta that existed in the valley of the Eurotas River in the southern Peloponnese, between roughly the 8th century and the 2nd century BC, and the Sparta that existed in the minds of the people who wrote about it. That gap is not small. It is not the ordinary gap between a historical event and the account of that event, the kind of distortion that enters any record through the imperfections of memory and the limitations of perspective. That kind of gap is normal. Every history has it. What happened to Sparta is different in kind, not just in degree. What happened to Sparta is that the account almost entirely replaced the event, that the story became so dominant, so aesthetically compelling, so politically useful to so many different people across so many different centuries, that the actual city, the real place, with its real economics and its real demography and its real military record and its real, particular, intimate human suffering, was effectively buried under its own legend while it was still standing. This is a thing we need to understand first, before anything else. Sparta did not have mythology imposed on it after it fell, the way that distant civilizations sometimes acquire romance through their disappearance. It was mythologized in real time by contemporaries, many of whom had strong and specific reasons to prefer the myth to the reality. And then that mythology was inherited by the next generation, and the next, each generation adding its own layer of interpretation, its own political needs, its own aesthetic preferences, like varnish applied over varnish, until what you're looking at, if you look at how most people think about Sparta today, bears approximately the relationship to the original that a copy of a photograph bears to the face it first recorded. You can still see something in it, but you cannot trust the details. So, let us name what most people think they know before we begin the work of looking underneath it. Most people, if you ask them to describe Sparta, would say something like this. Sparta was a warrior state. Its male citizens were trained from childhood, removed from their families at age 7, and entered into a brutal, total military education to become the finest soldiers in the ancient world. They were physically perfect. They were emotionally austere. They did not value wealth or comfort or art or philosophy. They valued only courage, discipline, and sacrifice. Their women were strong and independent, trained alongside men, expected to produce warrior sons, and to send those sons to war without grief. Their economy was deliberately simple. They used iron bars as currency to prevent the accumulation of private wealth and the corruption it brings. They ate communally at common tables, equal in their austerity. And at Thermopylae in 480 BC, 300 of them held a narrow pass against an invading Persian army of perhaps 200,000 men, or 1 million, depending on which ancient source you prefer, and died to the last man, buying time for Greece, demonstrating, for all time in the most absolute possible way, what it looks like when courage is the only thing that matters. This is a story. It is a beautiful story. It has the architecture myth, the small number against a vast number, the certain death chosen freely, the last stand that saved civilization, the epitaph written on the stone at the pass. Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. It is compact. It is clear. It has a beginning, a confrontation, and a noble end, and it asks almost nothing of the listener except admiration. The problem is not that the story is entirely false. Some of it is true. There was a battle at Thermopylae. 300 Spartiates did die there, along with several hundred Thespians and Thebans whose names and sacrifices the myth has almost completely swallowed. The agoge training system existed. The Syssitia communal meals existed. Spartan women did have more legal and social freedoms than women in Athens, though the nature and extent of those freedoms is a subject of genuine and ongoing scholarly debate. The problem is that the true parts have been cut loose in the context that gives them meaning. And context, in history as in almost every other domain of understanding, is not decoration. Context is the thing itself. Remove the context, and you do not have a simplified version of the truth. You have a different truth entirely. A truth that points in a different direction, toward different conclusions, in service of different interests. Here is the question that the Spartan mirage forces us to ask. How did a city-state that enslaved an entire neighboring population, a population that outnumbered it at various points in its history, by ratios of somewhere between 7 and 10 to 1, convince the majority of the educated Western world, for 2,500 years, that it was a supreme exemplar of freedom, discipline, and martial virtue? How did a state whose citizen population collapsed over 3 centuries, from roughly 8,000 adult male citizens to fewer than 1,000, a demographic catastrophe so severe that the ancient Greeks had a specific technical term for it, oliganthropia, the scarcity of men? How did that state acquire and maintain a reputation for producing the finest warriors on earth? How did a city that built almost nothing in stone, no great temples, no monumental civic architecture, no walls, no harbor, no library, become, in the imagination of subsequent civilizations, the embodiment of concentrated, disciplined, lasting power? And how did the story of 300 men at a mountain pass, men who, by almost every military assessment, were sent to a position where death was inevitable and tactical success was secondary to propaganda value, become the founding text of tradition that is still, in the present day, being used to justify political ideologies that the Spartans themselves would have found incomprehensible? These are not rhetorical questions. They have answers, or partial answers, or honest approximations of answers that the evidence will support, and we are going to work through them carefully. But they also have a deeper structure beneath them, a structure that is, in some ways, more interesting than any individual answer, because the story of how the Spartan myth was made and maintained and transmitted, and why it keeps finding new audiences in new centuries, tells us something fundamental about how human beings relate to the past, about what we need from history, about the particular hunger, and it is a hunger, something that operates below the level of reason, in the part of the mind that receives stories before the critical faculties have a chance to evaluate them, for a version of the world in which excellence is simple, sacrifice is clean, and the difference between the strong and the weak is a matter or rather than circumstance. Here is what we know. We know that Sparta left almost no written records of its own. This was not an accident of survival, the way that other ancient archives have been lost to fire and flood and the slow dissolution of papyrus in damp soil. The Spartans produced almost no written records in the first place. Their education system, their laws, their core civic values, all of these were transmitted orally, deliberately, as a matter of explicit policy. Writing things down in the Spartan worldview was a form of weakness. It implied that the tradition might not survive in the bodies and memories of living men. The Spartan state trusted its citizens to carry its values the way soldiers carry orders, in their heads, not on paper. The practical consequence of this for historians is severe. Every major account of Spartan society that has come down to us, every description of the agoge, every analysis of the Helot system, every portrait of Spartan customs and laws in daily life, was written by a non-Spartan, mostly by Athenians, some by Romans writing centuries after Sparta's power had faded, a handful by other Greeks, Thebans, Corinthians, Argives, most of whom had their own complicated political relationships with Sparta and their own reasons to describe it in particular ways. We have, in effect, been reading Sparta the way you would read a court case in which only one side submitted evidence, and the side that submitted the evidence had, in many cases, a vested interest in a particular verdict. Here is what we do not know. We do not know what the Helots thought. We do not know their names, their internal social structures, their religious practices, their kinship systems, their experience of violence that was visited upon them as a matter of official Spartan state policy. We have fragments, references in passing from outside sources, inferences from archaeology, a handful of place names and cult sites that may preserve traces of Messenian cultural continuity. But the interior life of the largest population group in Lacedaemon is almost entirely invisible to us. They were the majority. They did the work that made everything else possible. And they were, for the purposes of the historical record that survived, not quite people. Sit with that. In a state that the Western tradition has spent 2.5 millennia celebrating as the purest expression of human discipline and communal virtue, the largest single population group has been so thoroughly erased from the record that we cannot tell you what they call their own children. And here's why it still matters. Myths do not retire. They do not age out of relevance the way technologies do, or political systems, or fashions and philosophy. Myths adapt. They find new hosts. They migrate from one political context to another, carrying their emotional payload intact, while their factual content quietly transforms to suit the new environment. The Spartan myth has been doing this continuously for 25 centuries, and it is doing it right now, in the present day, in contexts that range from the benign, the rhetoric of elite athletic training programs, the marketing language of military academies, to the considerably less benign, which we will come to in due course. What we are doing tonight is not archaeology. It is not an exercise in correcting a historical error for the satisfaction of being accurate. What we are doing is tracing the life of a story, following it from the hands of a potter in the Kylix district through the philosophical academies of Athens, across 2.5 millennia of political appropriation and cultural reinvention, all the way to the present, where it is still moving, still finding new mouths to speak through, still shaping, in ways both obvious and subtle, how people think about strength and sacrifice, and what it means to belong to something larger than yourself. That is a story worth telling carefully. So we will begin at the beginning, not with the myth, with the place. The Eurotas River does not rush. This is the first thing that surprises people who travel to the southern Peloponnese expecting drama, expecting a landscape that matches the severity of the civilization most famously associated with it. The Eurotas moves slowly, wide and shallow in the summer months, running between banks of oleander and plane trees, the water carrying particular greenish clarity of a river fed by limestone aquifers rather than surface runoff. In spring, in March and early April, when the snowmelt from the high ridges of Mount Taygetos to the west has swelled it, but not yet muddied it, the Eurotas catches the light in the late afternoon in a way that makes the valley floor look briefly gilded. The surrounding plain extends maybe 8 kilometers east to west at its widest point, bounded on the west by the long wall of Taygetos, which runs nearly parallel to the river for 70 kilometers, its highest peak reaching 2,407 meters above sea level, and on the east by the lower, gentler ridges of Mount Parnon, which top out around 1,900 meters and carry a different quality of light. Less harsh than Taygetos, more prone to morning cloud. Between these two ranges, in this valley, with this river, the soil is some of the most productive agricultural land in the southern Greek world. Alluvial clay deposited over millennia, well-drained but moisture-retentive, deep enough to support grain crops without irrigation in most years, a rarity in the Mediterranean, where thin, rocky soils and irregular rainfall make cereal farming a constant negotiation with uncertainty. The valley of Eurotas grows wheat and barley reliably. It supports olive groves and fig orchards. It feeds, without particular strain, a settled, agricultural population considerably larger than a careful reading of the Spartan myth would lead you to expect. In the 7th century BC, let us say 650 BC, give or take a generation, this valley was home to a city that looked, by the standards of the Greek world, entirely normal, more than normal, lively, Lacedaemon, the formal name of the city-state that occupied this valley, of which Sparta proper was the urban center and the surrounding communities, the dependent settlements, was, in the 7th century BC, a place of genuine cultural productivity. It produced poetry. It produced music. It produced fine decorated ceramics that circulated in Mediterranean trade networks from the Aegean coast to the western shores of Italy. It hosted athletic competitions and religious festivals that drew participants from other Greek communities. Its craftsmen worked in bronze with delicacy that was recognized and valued far beyond the Peloponnese. This is not the Sparta of popular imagination, but it is the Sparta that the archaeology describes, and it is the Sparta we need to understand, because the distance between this city, this open, culturally ambitious, outward-looking 7th century community in the Eurotas Valley, and the militarized garrison state that replaced it is the real subject of this investigation. Not the myth, the transformation. Because the transformation is where the human cost lives, and the human cost is what the myth was specifically designed to obscure. Let us begin with the dogs. The Laconian hound, Canis lupus familiaris, Laconian breed, known in the ancient sources as the Lacan or the Laconite, was one of the most celebrated hunting dogs of the ancient Greek world. It appears in the poetry of Xenophon, in the agricultural writings of Columella, in descriptions of aristocratic hunting culture from the 5th century BC onward. The breed was lean and long-legged, built for speed over open ground rather than for the thick scrub hunting that required a heavier, more powerful dog. It was specifically Laconian, bred in this valley, adapted to this terrain, the product of generations of careful selection by people who understood the landscape they lived in with an intimacy that only comes from sustained, loving attention. This is a small detail, but it is the kind of detail that tells you something larger. A community that produces a distinctive, celebrated, widely exported breed of hunting dog is a community embedded in a particular landscape, with particular leisure practices, with the agricultural surplus to support the maintenance of non-working animals, with connections to the wider Greek world that allow the reputation of its dogs to travel. It is a community that is, in the full sense of the word, civilized, not in the condescending sense that Western historiography sometimes uses to mean culturally sophisticated in specifically Greco-Roman ways, but in the literal sense, a community organized around civic life, around the pleasures and obligations of settled, peaceful existence. In the valley of the Eurotas, in the 7th century BC, the Laconian hounds ran through fields of wild thyme and flowering asphodel, and someone took the time to breed them carefully, and someone else took the time to write poetry about them, and someone else took the time to paint their lithe, running forms on the sides of ceramic vessels that would eventually be traded as far away as the Etruscan settlements of central Italy. This is where we need to pause and talk about Alcman. Alcman of Sparta, or Alcman of Sardis. If you accept the ancient biographical tradition that places origins in Lydia rather than Lacedaemon, a question that remains genuinely unresolved, was active as a poet in Sparta in approximately the second half of the 7th century BC, most likely between 650 and 600 BC. He is the earliest lyric poet from whom we have substantial surviving fragments, and the fragments we have are, by any measure, remarkable. He composed Parthenia, choral songs of performance by groups of young women at public religious festivals. These were not private compositions. They were public, civic, ceremonially significant events, performed in daylight, at sanctuaries, before audiences that included the entire community. And the content of Alcman's Parthenia, what we can reconstruct from the papyrus fragments discovered in Egypt in the 19th century, particularly the long fragment known as Parthenian I, which survives in a damaged but largely readable state, is, by any reasonable reading, extraordinarily sensuous. He writes about the beauty of specific named young women. He describes their hair, their voices, their physical grace, the quality of their movement. He writes about desire, not with the explicit eroticism of some later Greek poetry, but with a directness and a warmth that leaves no ambiguity about the emotional register. He writes about the natural world with precise, joyful observation, the quality of light at different times of day, the specific colors of specific flowers, the way the Eurotas looks at dawn. This is not the culture of a militarized garrison state. This is a culture of community that has the leisure, the emotional vocabulary, the aesthetic confidence, and the civic institutional framework to produce and publicly celebrate poetry of great sophistication about beauty and desire and the pleasures of embodied life. And it is not only Alcman. The archaeological record of 7th and early 6th century Laconia is, by the standards of the ancient Greek world, genuinely impressive. Laconian black figure pottery, a distinct regional style characterized by particular decorative conventions, including the celebrated bird bowl, which precise, stylized waterfowl rendered against a cream slip ground, has been found in systematic excavation contexts across the Mediterranean. William Kavanagh of the University of Nottingham and Richard Catling of the British School at Athens, in a Laconia survey published in 1984 and supplemented by a second volume in 1996, documented the distribution of Laconian ceramic products in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BC and found them in trading contexts as far west as the Etruscan settlements of modern Tuscany, as far east as the Greek colonies of the Black Sea coast. This is long-distance trade. This is a community integrated into Mediterranean commercial networks, producing goods that other communities valued enough to transport over considerable distances, participating in the exchange economy of the archaic Greek world with apparent confidence and apparent success. The bronze figurines are equally telling. Small votive bronzes from Laconian sanctuaries of the 7th century, discovered in excavations at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, which is beside the Eurotas at the edge of the modern city of Sparta, and at the sanctuary of Athena Chouklikos on the Spartan Acropolis, show a level of technical refinement and aesthetic ambition that is wholly inconsistent with the militarized, anti-aesthetic culture the later myth describes. Warriors, yes, but also animals, bulls, deer, horses rendered with careful attention to musculature and proportion. Female figures. Horses, the kind of small, expensive, beautifully made objects that circulate as prestige goods, as gifts, as expressions of wealth and cultivation. None of this suggests a society at war with beauty. None of this suggests a society that had decided, as a matter of civic philosophy, that the pleasures of material culture were corrupting and that the only legitimate human aspiration was military excellence. So what happened? The honest answer is that we are not entirely certain of the sequence of events, because the sources are incomplete and the archaeological record, though suggestive, does not speak for itself with the clarity we would prefer. But the broad outline is sufficiently well established that we can describe it with reasonable confidence. What happened was Messenia, to the west of the Taygetos Range, beyond those high limestone ridges that form the western wall of the Eurotas Valley, beyond the passes that are cold and narrow even in summer and genuinely dangerous in winter, lay the Messenian Plain, another fertile river valley, the Promisos drainage system, comparable in agricultural productivity to the Eurotas Valley and perhaps marginally larger, occupied by a Greek-speaking population. The Messenians, who by the 8th and 7th centuries BC had developed a settled agricultural society of their own, with their own sanctuaries, their own traditions, their own emerging civic identity. The Spartans wanted it. The First Messenian War. The chronology is debated, but most modern scholarship places it in the later 8th century BC, approximately around 740 to 720 BC, ended with the Spartan conquest of Messenia. The Messenians were not enslaved individually and distributed as chattel property among Spartan citizen households. The way slaves were owned in Athens and elsewhere, they were enslaved collectively, as a people, bound to the land they had always worked, required now to deliver a fixed proportion. Ancient sources say half of everything they produced as Spartan masters they had not chosen and could not escape. They were called Helots. The etymology is disputed. Some ancient sources derived it from the town of Helos in Laconia. Others connected it to a Greek root meaning captured. But the institution itself is not in serious doubt. The Helots were a serf population, neither free nor privately owned, belonging collectively to the Spartan state, working the agricultural land of Messenia and of Laconia itself, producing the surplus that fed the Spartan citizen class and freed that citizen class from the economic necessity of working the land themselves. This arrangement required something. It required the permanent, credible threat of violence on a scale sufficient to keep a population that outnumbered its overseers, from the beginning and would grow in disproportion as the centuries passed, from rising, organizing, and ending the arrangement by force. The Messenians tried this. The Second Essenian War. Most modern scholars place this in the later 7th century BC, roughly 660 to 640 BC, in the generation after Alcman, was a sustained Messenian revolt against Spartan domination that came genuinely close to succeeding. The Spartan poet Tertius, the one major Spartan literary voice of this period, whose work survives in fragments, wrote martial elegies during this war, urgent, desperate-sounding poems exhorting Spartan men to hold, to fight, to not break under the pressure. These are not the poems of supremely confident military power, watching an inferior opponent thrash pointlessly against its control. These are the poems of society that is frightened. The Spartans won. But the cost of winning, the psychological cost, the organizational cost, the permanent, unrelenting cost of maintaining control over a hostile, numerous, increasingly organized slave population in the generations that followed, transformed the city. And the transformation was, by historical standards, extraordinarily rapid. Within roughly 2 generations of the end of the Second Messenian War, the archaeological record of Laconia changes. The Laconian ceramic exports slow and then stop. The fine bronze figurines become scarcer, then disappear almost entirely from the archaeological context that marked them as luxury or prestige goods. The evidence of long-distance trade contracts. The material culture of Laconia, which had been developing along trajectories broadly comparable to its neighbors in the 7th century, abruptly decouples from the wider Greek world. Sparta turns inward. It does not just turn inward economically. It turns inward culturally, philosophically, institutionally. The elaborate choral music that Alcman had composed for public performance by mixed gender groups, that public, sensuous, aesthetically ambitious communal culture. Contracts. Foreign visitors become unwelcome, then officially restricted. The famous Xenolasia, the official expulsion of foreigners, becomes a standing policy. The city that had been producing celebrated hunting dogs and fine bronze figurines and choral poetry for public consumption begins, instead, to produce warriors. Only warriors. As a matter of explicit, total, institutional priority. The educational system is reorganized around this single goal. The Syssitia communal dining arrangements are formalized and made compulsory. The laws attributed to the semi-mythical lawgiver Lycurgus, whoever Lycurgus actually was, and the honest answer is that we do not know, with some scholars arguing for a real historical figure in the 9th century BC, and others treating him as a retrospective fiction used to give divine authority to practices that developed incrementally. These laws codify the new priorities into a total civic framework. And the culture that had supported Alcman's Parthenia, that had bred the Laconian hound and traded its bird bowls to Etruscan aristocrats, goes quiet, not gradually. Abruptly, the archaeological record shows a break, not a fade. Something was decided, something was chosen, and what was chosen was the permanent militarization of the citizen class as the price of maintaining control over the Helot majority. The Spartan citizen became, first and always, a soldier, because the alternative, the relaxation of military discipline, the diversification of civic values, the reintegration of the city into the wider Greek commercial and cultural world, would have meant the gradual erosion of the terror infrastructure on which the entire economic foundation of the state depended. The Laconian hound still ran through the Eurotas Valley, but the valley it ran through had become something else. The workshops had gone quiet. The choral odes had stopped traveling. The bird bowls were no longer being loaded onto trading ships at the Laconian coast. The 7th century city, with its poetry and its bronze work and its exported dogs and its integration into the wider Mediterranean world, had been deliberately, systematically dismantled, not by an external conqueror, but by the Spartan state itself, which recognized correctly that cultural openness and the permanent military suppression of a subject population are fundamentally incompatible. You cannot have Alcman and the Cryptia. You have to choose. Sparta chose. And what it chose to burn in order to build the garrison state that the Athenian painter on the drinking cup would one day idealize was itself. Sit with that for a moment. The most celebrated military culture in Western history did not arise from strength. It arose from fear. It was not built because Sparta was naturally, culturally predisposed toward martial excellence and austere civic virtue. It was built because Sparta had made a choice in the 8th and 7th centuries BC that trapped it, that committed it irrevocably to a course of permanent military mobilization as the only alternative to being overwhelmed by the people it had enslaved. The agoge, the Syssitia, the Xenolasia, the Cryptia, all of it, the entire apparatus of the Spartan military state, was not an expression of Spartan values. It was the price of Spartan survival. And the bitter extraordinary irony at the center of everything we're going to examine tonight is this. The city that paid that price, that burned its own poetry, closed its own workshops, expelled its own visitors, turned its own children into instruments of collective survival, that city was then remembered by the people who had never seen it as the most free, the most noble, the most purely human society that the ancient Greek world produced. The man in the Kylix district, painting his idealized warrior on the inside of a drinking cup, was painting the lid on a grave. He just didn't know what was buried inside it. There is a particular kind of silence that archaeologists learn to read, not the silence of absence, of sites that were never occupied, never built upon, never worked. That silence is neutral. It carries no information beyond the fact of emptiness. The silence that matters, the silence that tells a story, is the silence of cessation. The silence of a kiln that was fired regularly for generations and then, within a period short enough to fall below the resolution of the stratigraphic record, was not fired again. The silence of a trade network that left its traces, the sherds, the transport amphoras, the weight stones, the quayside installations, in the archaeological context of a dozen Mediterranean ports, and then simply stopped producing those traces, not gradually, not in a long decline, but in a break so sharp that the researchers who first documented assumed they had made an error and went back to check their dating. They had not made an error. What William Cavanaugh and Richard Catling found, working systematically through the ceramic evidence of Laconia in the decades following the first Laconia survey of 1984, was not a gradual decline in Laconian export pottery. It was a cliff edge. Laconian black figure ceramics, the bird bowls, the distinctive cup forms, the small decorative vessels that had circulated from Etruria to the Black Sea in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BC, essentially disappear from external archaeological context after approximately 550 BC. Not because the demand disappeared, not because the quality declined, not because some external shock disrupted the trade networks that carried them. The pottery simply stopped being made for export. The workshop stopped producing it. And the silence that followed is, once you know what you're listening for, extraordinarily loud. This is the first of three categories of evidence we need to examine carefully tonight. The second is demographic. The third is skeletal. Together they form something close to a complete picture. Not the picture myth offers, which is coherent and clean and points in a single direction, but the picture the evidence offers, which is complicated and in places genuinely ambiguous and points in several directions simultaneously, some of which are deeply uncomfortable. We will take them in order. The ceramic record first. The cessation of Laconian export pottery after approximately 550 BC is not simply an economic data point. It is a window into the internal logic of the Spartan state transformation we described in the last act. Long-distance trade in the ancient Greek world required specific institutional conditions. Craftsmen with time and resources to produce surplus goods, merchants or state agents with the authorization and the infrastructure to transport those goods, port facilities and trading relationships that allowed commercial exchange with foreign communities, and, crucially, a civic culture that valued the goods that trade brought in return, luxury items, foreign raw materials, aesthetic novelties, the social currency of cosmopolitanism. The Spartan state, as it reorganized itself in the 6th century BC around the single priority of military preparedness and Helot control, systematically eliminated each of these conditions. The craftsmen who had produced the export pottery did not disappear. They were Laconian, probably a mix of Spartan perioikoi, the free but non-citizen inhabitants of the towns and villages surrounding the Spartan urban core, and possibly some Helot artisans working under supervision. They still existed, but the institutional support for their work, the commercial networks, the authorization to engage with foreign buyers, the cultural appetite for the kind of aesthetic ambition that produces exportable luxury goods was withdrawn. Sparta closed the channels through which its earlier cultural productivity had flowed outward into the Mediterranean world. And the result was not just economic contraction, it was cultural suffocation. Anton Powell of the University of Wales, in his analysis of Spartan information, Control published in the edited volume The Shadow of Sparta in 1994, makes the point with particular precision. The Xenolasia, the official policy of expelling foreigners from Lacedaemon, was not primarily a security measure, though it functioned as one. It was a censorship mechanism. Foreign visitors observe. They compare what they see with what they know from elsewhere. They carry impressions home and discuss them. They write in some cases, and what they write circulates. The Spartan state, Powell argues, understood that controlling the flow of observation was as important as controlling the flow of goods. You cannot maintain a myth of invincibility, cannot project the illusion of a perfect, disciplined, self-sufficient martial civilization, if you allow visitors free access to the reality of a garrison state held together by state-sponsored terror and the brutal exploitation of an enslaved majority. So the workshops closed. Or rather, the workshops continue to produce because the perioikoi communities of Laconia never entirely cease their craft production, but they cease to produce for export, cease to produce for the wider Mediterranean gaze, cease to contribute to the image of Lacedaemon that the outside world received. What the outside world received instead was silence, interrupted by the controlled, carefully managed impressions that the Spartan state chose to release. Visiting diplomats, seen under supervision, in choreographed contexts, military contingents, observe in the field, performing the drills that have been honed to a terrifying precision. Stories, traveling by word of mouth, of Spartan austerity and Spartan courage and Spartan indifference to suffering, which the Spartans themselves were not above encouraging. The silence of the workshops was the first instrument of mirage. Now the demography. The technical term is oliganthropia. It appears in Greek historical sources from the 4th century BC onward, used to describe a condition that the ancient writers clearly regarded as paradoxical and somewhat baffling. The progressive, apparently unstoppable decline in the number of Spartan citizens. Not Lacedaemonians broadly, not the perioikoi or the Helots or the various intermediate categories the Spartan social system had generated over centuries, but Spartiates, the full citizen warrior class, the men who had completed the agoge, who ate at the syssitia, who voted in the assembly, who served in the phalanx, and on whom the entire military and political system of the state depended. In the early 5th century BC, at the time of the Persian Wars and the Battle of Thermopylae, the number of Spartiates is estimated by modern demographers, working backward from the casualty figures given in ancient sources and forward from the census data preserved in Herodotus and Thucydides, at somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 adult males. This is a relatively modest number even by the standards of Greek city-states of the period. Athens in the same era had perhaps 30,000 adult male citizens. But 8,000 trained, organized, militarily specialized warriors, supported by the agricultural surplus of a large Helot population, and backed by the network of perioikoi communities, was a genuinely formidable force. By the time of the Battle of Leuctra, in 371 BC, approximately 110 years later, the number of Spartiates had fallen to somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500. The precise figure is debated. The trend is not. Let's be precise about what that number means. A decline from roughly 8,000 to roughly 1,200 over 110 years represents a population loss of approximately 85% in a period during which the Greek world as a whole was not experiencing significant demographic catastrophe. Athens recovered from the plague of 430 BC. Corinth grew. Thebes expanded. Sparta shrank, catastrophically and continuously, at a rate that alarmed even ancient observers who were otherwise inclined to admire the Spartan system. If you took a city of 40,000 people, roughly the population of a small American city, say Flagstaff, Arizona, and watched it lose 85% of its governing class over the span of 4 human generations, you would not describe it as a stable, successful system producing excellent outcomes. You would describe it as a system in terminal crisis. The causes of oliganthropia are themselves a subject of genuine academic debate, which is worth engaging honestly because the debate illuminates the internal contradictions of the Spartan system in ways that no single cause explanation can. The traditional explanation, accepted by ancient writers like Aristotle and modern scholars like Paul Cartledge, centers on the inheritance system. Spartan land was supposed to be distributed in equal lots. The kleroi, which passed from father to son, and provided the agricultural surplus that funded each citizen's contribution to his syssitia mess. A citizen who could not pay his syssitia dues lost his citizen status. He became a hypomean, an inferior, which effectively meant ejection from the political community. The problem was inheritance law. Spartan women could inherit property. This sounds, and in some respects was, a progressive feature of Spartan society relative to Athenian norms. But the practical consequence, as Stephen Hodgkinson of the University of Nottingham documented in exhaustive detail in Property and Wealth in Classical Sparta, published in the year 2000, was a progressive concentration of land ownership. As estates passed through female heirs and were combined through marriage with other estates, the land became concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. By the 4th century BC, Aristotle noted with explicit alarm that 2/5 of the land of Lacedaemon was in the hands of women. The consequence was a growing class of Spartan males who could not fund their succession dues and therefore lost citizen status. Not because they had failed militarily, not because they lacked courage or discipline, but because the inheritance system had left them without the economic foundation the civic system required. Sit with that. The most celebrated warrior culture in Western history was destroying its own warrior class through property law. But Hodgkinson's work goes further than simply documenting the mechanism of decline. It dismantles, with careful, patient, paper-by-paper methodological rigor, one of the most foundational claims of the Spartan myth, the idea of economic equality. The myth insists that Sparta was a community of equals, the homoioi, literally the similars, in which every citizen lived at the same level of austere simplicity, ate the same food at the communal table, wore the same plain cloak, refused the corrupting seductions of private wealth. This image of radical egalitarianism is one of the myth's most powerful and most frequently recycled features. It is the thing that made Plato admire Sparta. It is the thing that makes various modern political movements across the ideological spectrum invoke Sparta as a model. It was, Hodgkinson demonstrates, substantially false. The archaeological evidence from Laconian sanctuaries, the votive offerings, the dedications, the material goods left by worshippers at the shrines of Artemis Orthia and Poseidon at Teneron, shows clear differentiation in wealth. Rich offerings and poor offerings side by side in contexts that cannot be explained away as perioikoi contributions or Helot dedications. The literary sources, read carefully and against the grain of their ideological commitments, show Spartan aristocrats owning race horses, winning at Olympia and Nemea, maintaining lavish households, entertaining foreign guests with style that sits poorly with the image of communal austerity. Sparta had a wealthy elite. It had a citizen underclass. The ideology of the homoioi was precisely that, an ideology, a performed equality that papered over the actual social stratification of the citizen body. This was not a peripheral finding. This was the center of the myth. And Hodgkinson spent 2 decades methodically removing it, brick by brick, from the structure that supported for 25 centuries. The reception of his work in the field was, characteristically for paradigm-challenging scholarship, initially resistant. Senior scholars invested in the traditional picture pushed back. Reviews were skeptical. The evidentiary base was questioned. And then, over the following decade, as the weight of his documentation accumulated and other researchers began to find confirmation of his central claims in their own work, the field shifted. Not loudly, not with any public announcement of error. The way fields shift, through the slow preponderance of evidence, through the quiet revision of textbook chapters, through the gradual disappearance of confident assertions about Spartan economic equality from academic publications that would once have made them without hesitation. Now the skeletons. The third category of evidence is the most visceral, and in some ways the most direct, because it is the only category that puts us in the presence of the Helots themselves, or something close to that presence, given the limits of what physical anthropology can tell us about the lives lived inside the bodies it examines. Isotopic and skeletal analysis of grave sites in the Peloponnese has, over the past 3 decades, generated a body of data that is, when you know what you're looking at, quietly devastating. Strontium isotope ratios preserved in dental enamel, which forms in childhood and retains the isotopic signature of the local geology of the water and food consumed during formation, can identify individuals who spent their early years in one geological zone and their adult lives in another. Oxygen isotope ratios can indicate patterns of water consumption and, by extension, movement across climatically distinct regions. Together, these analyses can identify, with reasonable confidence, individuals who were not born in communities where they died, who were moved or who moved across the landscape in patterns inconsistent with voluntary migration. patterns consistent. In other words, with displacement, with the forced movement of populations, with slavery. The physical markers of heavy, repetitive, compulsory labor are written into bone with directness that no literary source can match. Enthesopathies, pathological changes at the sites where tendons and ligaments attach to bone, caused by repetitive mechanical stress, appear in skeletal populations under conditions of sustained heavy labor at rates and in patterns that allow physical anthropologists to distinguish with some confidence between the skeletal signatures of agricultural laborers, artisans, soldiers, and individuals who performed mixed heavy work from childhood onward. Skeletal remains from Peloponnesian sites dating to the classical period show, in certain populations, enthesopathic stress patterns consistent with lifetime heavy agricultural labor beginning in early adolescence or childhood, combined with evidence of chronic nutritional stress. Not starvation, but the systematic undernutrition of bodies required to perform heavy labor on insufficient caloric intake. Harris lines in long bones, indicating periods of growth arrest caused by nutritional deprivation. Enamel hypoplasia, horizontal defect lines in tooth enamel marking periods of physiological stress during childhood dental development. We cannot say with certainty that these are Helot skeletons. The honest answer is that we cannot always determine the social status of an individual from their physical remains alone, and the absence of written grave markers. The Helots left no inscriptions, means that the attribution of specific skeletal populations to the Helot class requires inference rather than direct evidence. This is a genuine epistemological limitation, and any presentation of this data that does not acknowledge it is overstating what the evidence supports. But we can say this. In the region occupied by classical Lacedaemon, among the skeletal populations that are not associated with the material markers of citizen class burial, no weapons, no prestige goods, no architectural grave enclosures, we find bodies that carry in their bones the signature lives organized entirely around heavy physical labor under conditions of nutritional constraint. These were not the warriors. These were the people who fed the warriors. And the warriors, whose myth has occupied the center of Western historical imagination for 25 centuries, constituted, at the height of Spartan power, perhaps 4 to 7% of the total population of Lacedaemon. Consider that number for a moment against the scale of the myth. The entire apparatus of the Spartan legend, the agoge, the phalanx, the 300 at Thermopylae, the warrior women, the iron currency, the communal meals, the austere civic virtue, all of it was generated by and attributed to a group that, in demographic terms, was roughly comparable to the administrative staff of a mid-sized American university. 4 to 7% of the total population, surrounded, on all sides, by a Helot majority that at various points in Spartan history outnumbered them by ratios that the ancient sources put at 7 to 1, and that modern demographic modeling suggests may have reached 10 to 1 in the 5th century BC. 10 to 1. If you place the entire permanent staff of a major urban hospital, doctors, nurses, administrators, technicians, support workers, all of them, in sole political and military authority over the population of the city in which that hospital sits, and then armed the staff and told them that their survival depended on preventing the city's population from ever organizing a collective response to their own subjugation, you would have a rough analogy for the ratio of Spartiate to Helot. Classical Lacedaemon. That is not a comfortable position to be in. That is, in fact, a position of profound structural terror, a terror not as strong over the weak, but the numerically and demographically fragile over numerically overwhelming. And this terror, the specific existential, inescapable demographic terror, is a key that unlocks the apparent paradox of Spartan history. Why did Sparta not expand when it had the military capacity to do so? Because expansion meant deploying your warriors away from a Helot population they were suppressing, and any significant reduction in the local military presence was an invitation to revolt. Why did Sparta refuse to build walls around its city, as Athens built walls, as Corinth built walls? Because walls, the Spartan argument were a sign of weakness, but also practically because the resources of the state were entirely consumed by the internal security apparatus. There was nothing left for walls. Why did Sparta execute so much of its diplomatic energy on building and maintaining the Peloponnesian League, the network of allied city-states that surrounded Lacedaemon? Because every allied city was, among other things, an additional buffer between Sparta and the possibility that a Helot revolt might receive external support. Every major feature of Spartan foreign and domestic policy, when examined against the demographic reality of the Helot ratio, turns out to be explicable as a response to that ratio, including the cryptia. The cryptia is described in our ancient sources, Thucydides most notably, Plutarch in his Life of Lycurgus, Aristotle in a fragment of his lost constitution of the Lacedaemonians preserved in later writers, with varying degrees of specificity and varying degrees of apparent discomfort. The basic description is consistent. Young Spartan men, at some point in or after their agoge training, were dispatched into the countryside, into the Helot-occupied agricultural territories, armed and provisioned to live off the land, with authorization to kill Helots. Thucydides, in the fourth book of his history of the Peloponnesian War, described an episode in which the Spartans invited Helots who had distinguished themselves in military service to present themselves for a reward, and then killed approximately 2,000 of them, precisely because they were the most capable, the most organized, the most potentially dangerous members of the Helot population. He notes, with a particular flatness he reserves for atrocities, that no one ever knew how each of them perished. Sit with that sentence. No one ever knew how each of them perished. 2,000 people, killed systematically, by state authorization, in a manner so carefully managed that the mechanism of death could not be traced to any individual act. This is not a massacre. A massacre is visible. A massacre leaves bodies in a pile, leaves witnesses, leaves a spatial and temporal footprint that can be documented and contested and remembered. What Thucydides describes as something more deliberate and in some ways more disturbing, a managed, distributed, deniable program of targeted killing, designed to decapitate the Helot population's leadership class without creating the kind of visible atrocity that might generate a wider response. This is state terror, with administrative precision. This is a thing that the Athenian painter on the drinking cup did not paint. He painted the crimson cloak and the idealized physique and the Corinthian helmet pushed back from the face. He painted courage in physical perfection and martial readiness. He did not paint the young man moving through the dark fields of Messenia with a knife, hunting the most capable members of a subject population by official government mandate. Both things were Sparta. Both were equally real. The myth kept one and erased the other. And what the myth kept, the warrior, the cloak, the single identifying word, is so aesthetically complete, so emotionally satisfying, so perfectly shaped to the human appetite for clear, heroic narrative, that it has persisted for over 25 centuries while the young man in the dark fields has left almost no trace in the cultural record. Almost none, but not none, and the traces that remain in the bone signatures of skeletal populations who work themselves to exhaustion on other people's land, in the cliff-edge silence of Laconian ceramic workshops, in the demographic mathematics of citizen class and progressive, catastrophic free fall. Those traces are what we've been doing the work of learning to read. This is not history as it is usually told. This is history as the evidence actually gives it to us. Complicated, partial, morally uncomfortable, resistant to the clean narrative shape that the myth prefers. The Spartan state was not free. Not the Helots, obviously, but not the Spartiates either. The citizen who had spent his childhood in the agoge, his young adulthood in the military barracks, his middle years in Sicilia, his entire life in a social system so total, so encompassing, so deliberately designed to eliminate the private self in favor of the collective military organism. That man was not free in any sense that the word can reasonably carry. He was an instrument, precisely engineered, carefully maintained, genuinely formidable within the narrow operational parameters for which he had been designed, and genuinely, profoundly trapped. The warriors were prisoners of the system as surely as the Helots were prisoners of the warriors. The system itself was a prison, and the prison was built, maintained, and justified by a myth of freedom so powerful, so aesthetically compelling, so deeply embedded in the Western cultural imagination that we are still, 25 centuries later, examining its foundations and finding them hollow, and finding that hollow, in the end, more interesting than any solid thing the myth could have offered. Begin with your feet. Feel the ground beneath them, the specific quality of ground that is not soil, not earth in the agricultural sense, but limestone, bare, fractured, Ancient limestone, the kind that has exposed to Mediterranean freeze-thaw cycles for so long that its surface has developed a texture like the skin of something that has survived far more than it was designed to survive. It is uneven in a way that is not random. Every surface irregularity has a reason, a fault line, a water channel, a differential weathering between harder and softer mineral strata. And if you are the kind of person who spent enough time on this terrain to learn its logic, you could move across it in darkness and near silence, as efficiently as across a paved road. You are standing on the high ridges of Mount Takedown. The elevation here is somewhere above 1,500 meters. The lower margins of the zone with scrub oak and the Calabrian pine give way to bare rock and the low, wind-compressed cushion plants that have found their accommodation with altitude. It is autumn in our reconstruction, late October, perhaps, when the temperature at this elevation drops to near zero at night, and the wind off the Aegean carries a quality of cold that is different from the cold of the valley below, drier, thinner, with less of the moisture that makes the Eurotas plain feel, in winter, like a cold room with wet walls. Up here the cold is clean. It is the cold of altitude and exposure. The cold of a place that does not particularly care whether you survive it. Below you, through a gap in the ridgeline to the east, you can see the valley. It is a long way down. The Eurotas plain from this vantage point has the quality of a map. The silver thread of the river catching what light remains, the patchwork of field systems spreading east toward the lower slopes of Parnon, the cluster of settlements that mark the ancient urban core. The scale of the distance is important. From up here, the valley does not look like a place of terror. It looks like a painting of abundance. Green and orderly and peaceful in the gathering dark. But this is not where we are. We are up here on the ridge, and we are asking a specific question. What are the young men who moved through this terrain? The members of Cryptia, the Spartan institution whose name derives from the Greek kryptein, to hide, to conceal. What did they know about this mountain that we do not? They knew the paths. Not the paths marked on modern hiking maps. Not the routes maintained by the Hellenic Alpine Club, which maintains a refuge on the upper slopes of Taygetos at a place called Prophytus Ilias at an elevation of approximately 2,200 meters. The other paths, the older ones, the narrow, unmarked traverses along the contour lines of the ridge, the descents that dropped into the Messenian plain on the western side of the range through gullies too steep and narrow for a force of any size to follow, the overnight routes that connected the high ground to the Helot agricultural settlements in the valleys below without passing through any of the periodical towns where a moving figure might be observed and remembered. These paths are gone now, or rather they've been absorbed into the general unmarked terrain of the mountain, indistinguishable from the routes made by goats and by the seasonal movement of shepherds. They leave no trace in the archaeological record. We cannot excavate a path. We can only infer its existence from the requirements of the institution that used it. And those requirements tell us something precise. The Cryptia, as the ancient sources describe it, was not a random license to kill. It was a managed directional program of state violence with specific operational logic. The young men sent out were not the youngest, not the most recently graduated from the agoge. They were selected. On what basis the sources do not agree, but the word selected is consistent across the accounts. They were sent in small groups or possibly alone. They were provisioned minimally, expected to supplement their rations from the countryside through which they moved. And their targets were specific. The Helots who were strongest, most capable, most potentially capable of organizing resistance. Paul Cartledge of Cambridge University, in his foundational study Sparta and Laconia, first published in 1979 and substantially revised in 2002, describes the Cryptia as functioning simultaneously on two levels. The first level is the one the ancient sources emphasize, a rite of passage, a training exercise, a test of the young man's ability to survive, navigate, and act independently in hostile terrain. All the skills of the collective agoge training, for all its rigor, could not fully develop, because collective training produces collective competence, and the Cryptia required individual competence. The second level is the one that matters more for our purposes tonight. The Cryptia was a terror management system. It operated on the Helot population way that certain kinds of institutional violence are designed to operate, not through the certainty of punishment for specific acts, but through the unpredictability of violence at any time, in any place, for reasons that the victim could not anticipate or prevent. A Helot farmer who was large, strong, well-organized, respected by his neighbors, who might, in other words, represent the nucleus of a potential resistance network, was at elevated risk. Not because he had done anything, because of what he was, because of the qualities that, in a free population, would constitute social virtue. This is a precise inversion that state terror requires, the conversion of social strength into individual vulnerability. And it worked. It worked well enough that, across the several centuries of Spartan dominance in the Peloponnese, the Helot uprisings that did occur, and they did occur, most significantly in the Great Revolt of approximately 464 BC, triggered by the catastrophic earthquake that struck Sparta in that year and killed, according to Plutarch, 20,000 people were suppressed with difficulty and with significant Spartan casualties, but suppressed. The earthquake revolt is worth a moment of attention because it illuminates the demographic terror of the Spartan position with particular clarity. In 464 BC, a seismic event of sufficient magnitude to collapse a significant portion of the city's built fabric struck Sparta. Ancient sources give casualty figures that are almost certainly exaggerated. Plutarch's 20,000 is almost surely too high, but that a major earthquake struck and killed a significant number of Spartans in this year is not seriously doubted. The Helots, primarily Messenia, read this correctly. The earthquake had not only killed Spartans, it had disrupted the security infrastructure, disorganized the command structure, and created, for a period that might be measured in weeks or months, a window of vulnerability. They moved. The revolt that followed lasted, by ancient accounts, for several years, potentially as long as a decade. The Spartans required Athenian military assistance to suppress it, which they received, and then, in one of the more spectacular diplomatic insults of the 5th century BC, sent home early, triggering a rupture with Athens that would contribute directly to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. The Helots had read the situation correctly. They had a window. They used it. And the fact that they were ultimately suppressed does not diminish the significance of the fact that they fought, organized, coordinated, sustained resistance over years that challenged the military supremacy of the most celebrated warrior state in the ancient Greek world. We will come back to this. For now, step back from the ridge. Come down from the mountain. We have somewhere else to be. The plain of Leuctra is flat. This should not need saying, but it does, because the word battlefield carries a geographic connotation, a sense of drama, of terrain that participated in the violence that occurred across it. Thermopylae has its famous pass. Marathon has its marsh. Salamis has its strait. But Leuctra, on the agricultural plain of Boeotia in central Greece, is simply flat. Rich agricultural land, the kind of land that the Boeotians have been farming for centuries and would go on farming for centuries more. Grain fields, olive groves, the low, undramatic horizon of a worked landscape. On a summer day in 371 BC, two armies walked into this landscape and arranged themselves facing each other across perhaps a few hundred meters of open ground. On one side, the Spartan-led alliance, perhaps 10,000 men in total, under the Spartan general Cleombrotus, who had crossed from the Peloponnese into Boeotia on a campaign intended, at least in part, to reassert Spartan dominance in central Greece following a period of diplomatic friction. Among those 10,000 were approximately 700 Spartiates, full citizens, trained from childhood in the agoge, organized into the Spartan phalanx with precision and a collective discipline that 2 centuries of institutional refinement had produced. On the other side, the Thebans and their Boeotian allies, fewer men in total, perhaps 6,000 infantry, by the most commonly accepted modern estimates, under the command of a general named Epaminondas. The name deserves its own moment of attention, because Epaminondas of Thebes is one of the figures in ancient history who receives less popular recognition than his actual historical significance warrants. He was not merely a general. He was a strategic theorist, a man who had thought seriously and systematically about what a phalanx actually was and what it was actually doing, and had arrived at conclusions that the Spartan military establishment, for all its 2 centuries of refinement, had never reached. What a Greek phalanx was doing in the standard tactical doctrine of the 5th and early 4th centuries BC was this. It was placing its best fighters on the right wing, because the right wing was where the best fighters went, where the commander went, where the most experienced unit led, where the decisive engagement of right wing against left wing would determine the battle's outcome. This was not a secret. Everyone knew it. The armies facing each other across the plain of Leuctra both knew it. Because both armies had been organized on the same assumption for as long as either of them had been fighting. Epaminondas saw the assumption. He saw it the way a mathematician sees the assumption buried inside a proof that everyone has been accepting without examination. As a convention mistaken for a necessity, a habit mistaken for a law. And he broke it. He placed his best fighters on the left wing. Not just placed them there, concentrated them there, in a column 50 ranks deep rather than the standard 8 to 12. The sacred band of Thebes, the elite unit of 150 paired soldiers, the institution said to have been founded by the Theban general Gorgidas and developed under the command of Pelopidas, based on the principle that men who were bound to each other by personal devotion would fight harder in each other's presence than men bound only by civic obligation, was positioned on the extreme left of the Theban line, directly opposite the Spartan right, directly opposite, in other words, the strongest part of the Spartan army, and he refused the rest of his line. The tactical term is oblique advance. The Theban left surged forward. The Theban right held back, angling away from engagement, forcing the Spartans on the Theban left to advance to make contact, and thereby extending and thinning their line in real time. It was a dynamic, adaptive deployment in an era when most military thinking was predicated on rigid, simultaneous advance across the entire front. What happened next took perhaps an hour. The Spartan right wing, the best fighters, the experienced veterans, the core of Cleombrotus' force, was hit by the full weight of the Theban left, 50 ranks deep, the sacred band at the tip. The physics of the collision were not complicated. A column 50 ranks deep exerts a force on a line 8 ranks deep that is not proportional to the difference in numbers. It is exponential in its effect, because the deeper formation does not simply press harder. It envelopes, it drives through, it breaks the integrity of the opposing line in a way that converts organized military resistance into individual physical survival. The Spartan right did not bend. It broke. Cleombrotus was killed in the fighting, along with 400 of the 700 Spartiates present. 400, in a single afternoon, on a flat agricultural plain in Boeotia. Sit with the arithmetic. For a moment, we established earlier that by 371 BC, the Spartiate citizen population had declined to somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 adult males. 400 killed in a single engagement represents somewhere between 27 and 40% of the entire remaining citizen class, killed in the span of a few hours, on a piece of ground that you could walk across in 15 minutes. The historian Victor Davis Hanson, in his work The Western Way of War, published in 1989, describes the physical reality of phalanx combat with a directness that is useful here. It was not surgical. It was not the individual heroism of cinematic battle. It was a sustained press of mass bodies, shields overlapping, spears and short swords working in a compressed space between lines, men dying from exhaustion and asphyxiation as much as from wounds. The psychological collapse that follows the physical collapse of the line, preceding the actual killing by a margin that could be measured in seconds. 400 Spartiates died in that compressed, exhausted, asphyxiating space. And Sparta never recovered. Not politically, not demographically, not militarily. The Battle of Leuctra marks, with the precision of a surgical incision, the moment at which the Spartan military myth, the myth of the unbreakable phalanx, the myth of the warrior who could not be defeated, was not damaged or qualified but empirically disproven. And yet, the myth survived. It survived Leuctra. It survived the Theban invasion, the Peloponnese that followed, in which Epaminondas liberated Messenia, founded the new city of Messenia on the slopes of Mount Ithome, and destroyed, in a single campaign, the economic foundation of the Spartan state by freeing the Helots whose labor had supported it. It survived the slow, unglamorous decline of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. It survived the Roman conquest, the Augustan tourism trade. Roman aristocrats visited Sparta the way later Europeans visited Greek ruins, looking for confirmation of a story they had already decided was true. The myth survived all of this because the myth had, by the time of Leuctra, already detached itself from the evidence. It was no longer dependent on Spartan military performance for its authority. It was dependent on Plato and Xenophon and the accumulated literary tradition that had been constructing the ideal Sparta in the libraries of Athens, while the real Sparta was dying on the plains of Boeotia. But there is one more place we need to visit, one more site that completes the picture. The modern Greek city of Sparta has a population of approximately 16,000 people. It is a pleasant, quiet, provincial city, the administrative center of the Laconia regional unit, situated on the east bank of the Eurotas River, at roughly the location of the ancient urban core. It has wide, tree-lined streets on a grid plan. The grid was laid out when the modern city was established in 1834 by order of the Bavarian regent Otto, who was governing Greece following independence from the Ottomans, and who wanted a modern European city to sit on this symbolically resonant site. Before Otto's grid, there was essentially nothing. This is a fact that Thucydides predicted in the 5th century BC, and it is worth reading the prediction carefully, because it is one of the most striking passages in ancient historiography. In the first book of his history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides writes, and I am paraphrasing rather than quoting directly, because the point is in the reasoning rather than the words, that if the city of Athens were ever abandoned, future observers would, from its ruins, significantly overestimate Athenian power. The temples, the walls, the harbors, the monumental civic architecture, all of it would suggest, to a later generation, a city of surpassing wealth and organizational capacity, which Athens was, but perhaps more grandly than even Athens deserved. If Sparta were abandoned, Thucydides continues, the opposite would occur. Future observers would significantly underestimate Spartan power, because Sparta had not built in proportion to its actual military and political strength. No great temples, no long walls, no monumental public buildings. The physical record of Sparta would suggest a minor, unremarkable city, which is precisely what the physical record has, in fact, suggested. If you walk through modern Sparta looking for the ancient city, what you find is this. Some foundation stones at the edge of the theater, visible in a small fenced archaeological area near the modern Acropolis, the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, beside the river, where excavations conducted by the British School at Athens in the early 20th century produced devoted deposits that are now our most important material evidence for Laconian religious practice. Thousands of small objects, lead figurines, terracotta masks, ivory carvings, bronze dedications spanning several centuries of continuous cult activity. A stretch of late Hellenistic or Roman wall on the Acropolis Hill, and scattered architectural fragments, blocks and column drums in the occasional capital, reused in later buildings, or sitting in the storerooms of the Archaeological Museum of Sparta, which is a small, underfunded, thoroughly charming institution on the main street of the modern city, where the objects are displayed in cases with handwritten labels and the lighting has the quality of a well-intentioned compromise. This is what remains. Compared to the Athenian agora, where the American School of Classical Studies has been excavating since 1931 and has produced a research output that fills entire library wings. Compared to Delphi, to Olympia, to Corinth, to any of the other major Greek sites where monumental architecture provided the structural armature around which a city's self-image could be built and preserved. Sparta has the river and the mountain behind it, and the museum with the handwritten labels. The Thucydides prediction has been confirmed with a completeness that would have satisfied even his stringent evidentiary standards. But here's the thing about Thucydides' observation that is usually missed. He meant it as a compliment. He was making a point about the gap between appearance and reality, about how physical grandeur can mislead, about how the truest measure of a city's power is not its ruins, but its actual historical record of military and political achievement. He was defending Sparta against the charge of mere appearance, the charge that would eventually be leveled at Athens, that the beauty of the city was a mask over the corruption of the democracy. Sparta's plain buildings, in Thucydides' reading, were evidence of authentic, unperformed power. We are in a position to complete his thought in a direction he did not intend. The plain buildings were not evidence of unperformed power. They were evidence of a state so completely consumed by the management of an internal security crisis, the permanent, total resource-consuming work of controlling a Helot majority that outnumbered them by ratios of 7 or 10 to 1, that there was nothing left over for architecture, no surplus of labor, no surplus of capital, no surplus of institutional attention. Every available resource, human and material, was directed toward the single priority of keeping the Helot population suppressed and the citizen class fed and armed and ready. The absence of monumental architecture was not austerity as a philosophical virtue. It was poverty as a structural outcome. The poverty of a state that had made one enormous, irrevocable decision, the subjugation of Messenia, and had then spent 3 centuries paying the compounding interest on that decision at the cost of everything else it might have built or made or been. Stand in the middle of the modern city of Sparta and look west toward Taygetos. The mountain is still there. It has not changed in any meaningful sense since the 7th century BC. The same limestone, the same altitude, the same quality of cold air coming down from the high ridges in October. Below the ridge, somewhere in the terrain between the tree-line and the valley floor, the paths that the young men of the Cryptea used to move in darkness are gone, absorbed into the mountain silence. Below you, the Eurotas is moving slowly, the way it has always moved, the way it moved when Alcman was alive to watch it and write about its quality of light. The river does not know what happened here. Or rather, the river has held all of it. The poetry in the workshops, and the bird bowls being loaded onto trading ships, and the young men with knives moving to the dark fields, and the earthquakes and the revolts and the catastrophic afternoon on the flat plain of Boeotia. And the river is still here, and the city that organized itself around the permanent suppression of an entire people is not. What is here instead is a story that survived the city. A story that outlasted the kills and the bronze workshops and the choral odes and the Cryptea and the battle of Leuctra and the Theban liberation of Messenia and the Roman tourists and the Byzantine silence and the Ottoman centuries and the Bavarian grid of the modern streets. A story painted on the inside of a drinking cup by a man who had never left Athens. And the question of how that story survived, how it defeated the evidence so completely and so durably, is a question we turn to next. Every myth needs a mechanism, not just a subject, a people, a place, a set of dramatic events that lend themselves to storytelling, but a specific, functional mechanism by which the story travels, by which it crosses the boundaries of time and geography and political context, finding new audiences in new centuries without losing the emotional core that made it compelling in the first place. Myths that endure are not simply good stories. They are stories that have been repeatedly, actively, deliberately carried by people who had reasons to carry them, who needed them, who found in them something that served a purpose the moment required. The Spartan myth has 2 such mechanisms. Not 1, 2, running in parallel. Sometimes reinforcing each other, sometimes in tension, always together producing something more durable than either could have produced alone. The first mechanism is external. The deliberate construction of a Spartan ideal by people who were not Spartan, writing in Athens, in the service of Athenian political arguments that had nothing to do with Sparta's actual history, and everything to do with Athens' own internal conflicts. The second mechanism is internal. The deliberate management of Spartan information, the active, institutionalized suppression, and shaping of what the outside world was allowed to know about Lacedaemon, conducted by a state that understood, with sophistication we rarely credit with, that reputation was a military asset as valuable as any phalanx. The academic debate about which of these mechanisms was primary, about how much of the mirage was made in Athens and how much was made in Sparta, is one of the more productive disagreements in the field of classical studies, because both sides have genuine evidence, and the genuine evidence on both sides reveals something true and important about how the myth was built and why it lasted. We will take them in the order in which they become visible to us. The Athenians first. In the year 404 BC, the Peloponnesian War ended. Athens lost. The defeat was not merely military, though it was that comprehensively. The long walls torn down to music of flutes, the Athenian fleet surrendered, the empire dissolved. It was psychological. It was a collapse of the civic narrative that had sustained Athenian identity for nearly a century. The narrative of Athens as the school of Greece, as the city that had led the resistance to Persia, as a civilization whose democratic institutions and cultural achievements represented the highest possible expression of Greek potential. That narrative required Athenian power to sustain it, and the power was gone. What followed was several years of profound political instability. The 30 tyrants, an oligarchic junta installed under Spartan patronage, conducted a campaign of judicial murder and property confiscation that killed approximately 1,500 Athenians and drove another 5,000 into exile before being overthrown in 403 BC. The restored democracy, attempting to reconstitute its civic identity from the rubble of defeat, put Socrates on trial in 399 BC on charges of impiety and corrupting the young, and executed him. In this environment, Athens, exhausted, traumatized, politically unstable, its democratic institutions discredited in the eyes of a significant portion of its intellectual class, a particular kind of thinking flourished. The thinking of men who had decided that democracy was the problem. These men are sometimes called, in modern scholarship, the Laconophiles, the Sparta lovers. They were not a formal group, not an organized political movement, but a loose intellectual tendency that shared several features: skepticism toward Athenian democratic institutions, admiration for political systems that concentrate authority in disciplined, virtuous elites, a tendency to look south and west toward the Peloponnese and see there, or to believe they saw there, or to construct there out of the materials the distance provided, a solution to the problems that democratic Athens could not solve for itself. Their most important representative is also the most important philosopher in the Western tradition, Plato. Plato of Athens was born in approximately 428 BC into a family of the Athenian aristocratic class. He was a student of Socrates, and the execution of Socrates in 399 BC was, by the evidence of his own writing, the event that most profoundly shaped his intellectual trajectory. He founded his academy in Athens sometime around 387 BC, and he spent the rest of his long life. He died in approximately 348 BC, constructing the most systematic and influential body of philosophical writing in antiquity. He was also, by any honest reading of his political philosophy, profoundly hostile to democracy. The Republic, his most celebrated work, is in large part an extended argument for a political system organized around a principle of hierarchical virtue. The best people, the philosopher kings, should rule, because only they possess the wisdom to govern justly. The many, the democratic mass, are too easily misled by desire, by appetite, by the rhetoric of demagogues, to make sound collective judgments. Democracy, in Plato's analysis, is a system that produces its own destruction because it gives political power to people who are not equipped to use it wisely, and they use it instead in the service of their own passions until the system collapses into tyranny. This is not a marginal view in the Republic. It is the central argument, and the political system that the Republic most closely resembles in its institutional structure is Sparta, the guardian class of Plato's ideal city, the warriors who protect the community, who are trained from childhood in a rigorous educational program, who live communally and hold property in common, who are forbidden the corrupting pleasures of private wealth and private family life, bears a structural resemblance to the Spartiates that is not accidental, and that Plato himself does not try to disguise. He references Sparta explicitly, and when he does, his tone is one of qualified admiration. Qualified because Plato was too intelligent to simply endorse the Spartan system wholesale. He knew, or should have known, given the intellectual resources available to him, that the Spartan reality was considerably messier than the Spartan ideal. He knew about the Helots, at least in outline, though he was not particularly interested in dwelling on them. He knew about the wealth inequality that the ideology of the homoioi papered over. He knew that the agoge, whatever it virtues as a system of military socialization, did not produce philosopher kings. But he needed a model. He needed a real, existing, historically attested example of a society organized around principles of collective discipline and hierarchical virtue, a society that could serve as evidence that his ideal was not merely theoretical, not merely a philosopher's fantasy, but something that a real human community had actually approximated. And Sparta, viewed from the comfortable distance of the Athenian academy, with its information carefully managed by the Xenolasia, its internal contradictions invisible behind the barrier of official secrecy, could be made to serve that purpose, could be made, with selective emphasis and strategic omission, to look like a proof of concept for the political philosophy of a man who had never spent a significant amount of time there. The cup and the painter, again, but with a philosopher's pen instead of a potter's brush. Xenophon is a more complicated case, and in some ways a more interesting one. Xenophon of Athens was born in approximately 430 BC into the equestrian class, the upper middle stratum of Athenian society, wealthy enough to maintain horses, socially positioned between the great aristocratic families and the commercial middle class. He was, like Plato, a student of Socrates. He was also, unlike Plato, a soldier, a practical man of affairs who led 10,000 Greek mercenaries out of the interior of Persia after a failed military expedition, an adventure he described in the Anabasis with a directness and a narrative energy that has kept it in print for 23 centuries. And he was, by his own explicit account, a lover of Sparta. He lived in Sparta. He sent his sons there to be educated in the agoge. He was granted an estate by the Spartan state at Scyllus in the Peloponnese, near Olympia, where he lived for several years after being exiled from Athens on charges that ancient sources variously describe as pro-Spartan sympathies or participation in the campaign of the Persian Prince Cyrus. The details are genuinely uncertain. He hunted and farmed and wrote prolifically, and among the works he produced was a short treatise known as the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, which is the most extensive account of Spartan institutional life to survive from a writer who actually spent significant time in Lacedaemon. The Constitution of the Lacedaemonians is, by the standards of modern historical scholarship, an extraordinary document, not because it is reliable. Modern scholars are divided on precisely how reliable it is, but because it is so transparently, so enthusiastically admiring. Xenophon describes the laws attributed to Lycurgus, the Spartan communal institutions, the agoge training system, the Syssitia dining arrangements, with a warmth and an approval that leaves no ambiguity about his personal response to what he observed. He believed in it, or he believed in some version of it, the version that a well-connected Athenian aristocratic military man, given supervised access to certain aspects of Spartan civic life, would be permitted to see. This is the crux of the interpretive problem that Xenophon poses for modern scholars, and it is a problem that Anton Powell of the University of Wales has examined with particular care in his work on Spartan information management. Powell's argument, developed across several publications and most fully articulated in the edited volume Sparta, New Perspectives from 1999, is that the Spartan state was not a passive object of Athenian projection. It was an active participant in construction of its own image. The access that men like Xenophon received, the meals they were invited to observe, the training they were permitted to watch, the conversations they were allowed to have with Spartan citizens, was not accidental access. It was managed access, curated access. The access that a sophisticated state with a strong interest in its own reputation would grant to a sympathetic foreign observer who was known to admire what he was being shown. Xenophon saw the performance. He may have seen it so completely, so convincingly, that he never realized it was one. Or he may have known at some level that it was a performance and chosen to write about it as if it were not, because the performance was what he needed, politically and intellectually, and the reality beneath the performance was something he preferred not to examine. The field is genuinely divided on this question. Elizabeth Rawson of Oxford, in her comprehensive study of the Spartan tradition in European thought, published in 1969, treats Xenophon's admiration as substantially sincere, a real man's genuine response to a real place that was genuinely different from what he knew at home. Powell treats it as something more complicated, sincere admiration operating within a frame of selective access that Xenophon may not have fully recognized, but that the Spartan state had deliberately constructed. Both readings are possible. Both are probably partially true. And this is in itself a significant finding, that the Spartan mirage was robust enough to operate on an observer who had lived in Lacedaemon for years, who had sent his sons to the agoge, who knew more about the daily reality of Spartan life than virtually any other outsider in the ancient world. The mirage was not made for fools. It was made with considerable institutional sophistication for exactly the kind of intelligent, observant, well-intentioned man who would be taken in by it precisely because of those qualities. Which brings us to the second theory. The theory that the mirage was not primarily an Athenian invention, not primarily the product of lacanophile intellectuals constructing a fantasy model of oligarchic virtue for their own political purposes, but was, in significant part, a Spartan creation, a product of deliberate Spartan information management, conducted at the institutional level, over a period of centuries, with strategic objectives that the Spartan state clearly understood and clearly prioritized. The evidence for this theory begins with the Xenolasia, which we have already discussed, but extends considerably beyond it. Consider the oral transmission policy. The Spartan decision to transmit their laws, their institutional knowledge, and their civic values through oral rather than written tradition is almost unique in the ancient Greek world. Other Greek states kept records. Athens maintained archives. Corinth kept financial accounts. Even small, relatively unsophisticated Greek communities produced inscriptions, laws carved in stone, decrees posted in public places, dedications made in writing at sanctuaries. Writing in the ancient Greek world was not a luxury or an elite accomplishment. It was a normal, widespread civic tool. Sparta chose not to use it. This choice is sometimes explained in the literature that reflects the Spartan myth back to us as a reflection of Spartan values. Writing things down was a kind of weakness, an admission that the tradition might not survive in the living memory and living bodies of citizens who had fully internalized it. The Spartan law lived in the Spartan man, not on a tablet. This is a beautiful explanation, and it may contain some truth about how Spartans understood themselves. But it also had a very practical consequence. It made Spartan institutions opaque to outsiders. If you cannot read the law, you cannot evaluate the law. If you cannot evaluate the law, you cannot compare it to what actually happens. If you cannot compare the law to what actually happens, you cannot identify the gap between the ideology and reality, the gap between the homoioi, the community of equals, and the actual wealth stratification that Hawkinson would eventually document. The oral tradition was not just a philosophical stance. It was a censorship mechanism that operated by preventing the creation of the record, rather than by suppressing a record that existed. No document, no accountability. No accountability, no correction. No correction. No gap between the ideal and the reality that anyone on the outside could reliably identify. Anton Powell draws a comparison to modern authoritarian states with their own sophisticated information management programs, and the parallel is uncomfortable but analytically useful. The specific techniques differ. The Xenolasia, the oral tradition, the managed access given to sympathetic outsiders like Xenophon, but the underlying logic is consistent with what political scientists who study modern autocracies call strategic ambiguity, the maintenance of controlled uncertainty about the state's actual capacities and intentions, because uncertainty is more deterring than transparency. A state whose military strength you cannot precisely evaluate is more frightening than a state whose military strength you can count. Sparta did not want to be counted. It wanted to be feared, and the mirage, the reputation for invincibility, for discipline, for a warrior class that was something other than human in its collective capacity for organized violence, was a primary instrument of that fear. This is the theory, and it has genuine explanatory power. It explains why Sparta invested in the performance of its identity. The elaborate rituals of the agoge, the communal meals conducted with formality that outsiders found impressive and slightly theatrical, the famous Spartan brevity in speech, the laconic wit that became so legendary that the word laconic, from Lacan, a Laconian, passed into English as a synonym for terse precision, while apparently caring very little about whether the reality behind the performance matched the performance itself. The performance was the point. The performance was the weapon. Now, these two theories, the Athenian intellectual invention and the Spartan information management, are sometimes presented in the literature as competing explanations, as if accepting one requires rejecting the other. This is, in the view of most serious modern scholars of Sparta, a false choice. The honest answer, and it is an answer that the evidence supports, is that both were operating simultaneously, in a relationship of mutual reinforcement that neither party fully controlled or fully intended. The Spartan state managed its image carefully, releasing carefully selected impressions to carefully selected outsiders. Those outsiders, the Xenophons, the Platonizing Athenian aristocrats, the Roman Stoics who would come later, took those impressions and amplified them, elaborated them, filtered them to their own political needs, and circulated them in forms that the Spartan state had neither created nor authorized, but that served Spartan interests perfectly well. The resulting myth was neither purely Athenian nor purely Spartan. It was a collaboration between Spartan information management and Athenian political need, conducted across a distance that prevented either party from fully seeing what the other was doing. The result was something more durable than either could have made alone. something that persisted long after both parties were gone. We need to pause here and introduce the man who first gave this phenomenon its name. François Olier was born in 1892 in the French city of Lyon, and he spent the majority of his academic career at the University of Lyon, where he taught Greek language and literature with the patient, meticulous attention, a scholar who understood that the most important questions in classical studies were often the ones that had been sitting in plain sight, unasked for generations. He was working in 1933. It is important to hold that date in mind. In 1933, the National Socialist Party of Germany achieved power under Adolf Hitler, who had been drawing explicit parallels between the Third Reich's political program and Spartan warrior values since the early 1920s. Mussolini's Italy had been invoking Spartan imagery in its fascist propaganda for more than a decade. The romanticization of Spartan militarism was not, in 1933, a harmless academic exercise in the application of classical references to political rhetoric. It was an active, contemporary, dangerous political phenomenon, and the claims being made about Sparta, that it represented the highest expression of racial purity, collective sacrifice, and the noble subordination of the individual to the state, were being made in service of programs that would, within a decade, produce the most comprehensive campaign of mass murder in human history. François Olier published Le Mirage Spartiate in that year, Volume 1 in 1933, Volume 2 in 1943, during the German occupation of France, which adds a layer of biographical courage to the scholarly achievement that is difficult to fully articulate. His argument was not that Sparta was unimportant or uninteresting. It was that the Sparta being discussed in the European political conversation was not Sparta. It was a literary construction, assembled from the selective reading of ancient sources by people with strong political motivations, and it had been mistaken for historical reality with consequences that were, by the time Olier was writing, visibly catastrophic. He called this construction the mirage, not because it was entirely illusory. Mirages are not illusions. They are optical phenomena produced by real physical conditions, but because it was a distortion produced by the particular conditions through which Sparta had been viewed, the distance, the heat of political need, the refractive quality of ancient literary tradition. The mirage of a water source in a desert is not a hallucination. It is real light, bent by real temperature gradients, producing a real image that is not where it appears to be. The Spartan mirage was real. The sources were real. The literary tradition was real. The image they produced was not where it appeared to be. And the people marching toward it in 1933. We're going to find out what you find when you reach the place where a mirage seems to promise water. Olier was received with a mixture of respect and resistance that paradigm-challenging scholarship typically receives. His erudition was unquestioned. His documentation was thorough. His central argument, that a systematic scholarly effort was needed to separate the historical Sparta from the literary Sparta, was accepted, in principle, by the field. The specific implications of that argument, however, the particular claims it made about specific canonical ancient texts and their political motivations, generated resistance that took several decades to overcome, and in some quarters has never been fully overcome. The process of overcoming it, the slow, paper by paper, decade by decade labor of replacing the mirage with the evidence, is a work that the second human face of this story spent his career doing. Stephen Hodgkinson grew up in England and studied classics at Cambridge before taking up a position at the University of Nottingham, where he would spend the bulk of his career. He is a quiet man, by the account of those who know him professionally, methodical, precise, not given to the dramatic theoretical claims that attract rapid attention and rapid refutation. He is the kind of scholar who prefers to be right about one thing carefully documented than approximately right about many things asserted with confidence. He spent approximately 20 years working on the question of Spartan property and wealth, not the dramatic question of the Cryptia, or the agoge, or the Battle of Thermopylae, the unglamorous, painstaking, archivally demanding question of how Spartan land was owned, transmitted, and concentrated across the classical period. He read every surviving reference to Spartan property rights in ancient sources. He compiled prosopographical data, biographical information about known Spartan individuals, to trace patterns of land ownership across generations. He analyzed the epigraphic and archaeological evidence for Spartan economic activity in the sanctuaries and grave sites that had been systematically excavated. He read the legal sources, the philosophical references, the passing mentions in historical narratives that were ostensibly about other things, but that contained, if you looked carefully enough, information about the economic structure of Spartan society. And he produced, in the year 2000, a book called Property and Wealth in Classical Sparta. It is not a book that most people outside the specialist field have read. It is not a book that has the narrative momentum of a work written for a general audience. It is dense, technical, extensively footnoted. The kind of book that expects its reader to care more about getting the answer right than about being entertained on the way to the answer. But it is, in the judgment of the scholars who have engaged most seriously with it, one of the most important books about Sparta published in the last half-century. Because what it demonstrates, with a patience and a documentary thoroughness that makes refutation extremely difficult, is that the central economic claim of the Spartan myth, the claim of radical egalitarianism, of the homoioi as a genuine community of material equals, is false, not exaggerated, not partially misleading. False. Sparta had wealthy citizens and poor citizens. It had a landowning elite and a citizen underclass. Its ideology of equality was performance, maintained, like so much else in the Spartan system, through a combination of genuine social pressure and the deliberate suppression of information that would have exposed the gap between ideology and reality. The communal meals, the plain cloaks, the iron currency, all of it was real in the sense that these institutions existed and that Spartans genuinely participated in them. But beneath the performance of equality, the land was concentrating. The wealthy were getting wealthier, and the citizen underclass was declining toward the demographic cliff edge of oliganthropia. The myth of Spartan equality was, like so many features of the Spartan system, a management tool. It managed the internal expectations of the citizen class, preventing the kind of explicit class conflict that might destabilize the civic unity the state required, while concealing from outsiders a degree to which the system was producing exactly the wealth stratification that the ideology claimed to prevent. Sit with what that means. Sparta was not the egalitarian warrior utopia. It was a class society with a better public relations strategy than most. Hodkinson's work was received, initially, with a skepticism that significant revisionist scholarship always generates. Reviewers questioned his methodology. Senior figures in the field questioned his sources. The resistance was genuine. He was challenging not just a historical claim, but a historiographical tradition with deep roots in the scholarly identity of classical studies, a tradition that had been constructed and maintained over 2.5 millennia, and that was not going to yield to one scholar's 20 years of careful documentation without a fight. But the documentation held. The field shifted, not loudly, not with any ceremony of collective acknowledgement. The way fields shift. Through the gradual revision of standard reference works, through the quiet disappearance of confident claims about Spartan economic equality from papers that would once have made them as background assumptions, through the next generation of graduate students treating Hodkinson's findings not as a controversial intervention, but as the established baseline from which further work proceeds. This is how paradigms actually change in academic disciplines. Not in a flash. In a slow, grinding, decade-long process of attrition that looks, from the inside, like the permanent frustration of legitimate evidence against entrenched institutional resistance, and looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. Ollier named the Mirage in 1933. Hodkinson began dismantling it, piece by careful piece, in the 1980s, and finished. Insofar as the work of dismantling a 2,500-year-old myth can be said to finish, in the year 2000. Between them, across the span of 7 decades, they gave us the most important analytical tools we have for looking at Sparta as it actually was, rather than as appeared to the men who painted it on the insides of drinking cups and built philosophical systems around the painting. They gave us a way to see through the mirage, not past it. The mirage is still there, still operating, still finding new audiences in new centuries, as we will see in a little while, but through it, to the place where the water is not, and to the place beyond that where the real thing, complicated, morally uncomfortable, historically irreducible, has been waiting all along to be seen. History is not a completed project. This seems obvious when stated directly, and yet the way history is most often consumed, in popular books, in documentary films, in the confident assertions of public intellectuals, implies something very close to its opposite. It implies a discipline that has done its primary work, that has established its major findings, that is now engaged mainly in the refinement of details around a settled core of established fact. A discipline in which the interesting questions have been answered, and what remains is the patient accumulation of supporting evidence for conclusions that are not seriously in doubt. This is not what history is. What history is, at its working edge, in the seminar rooms and field excavations and archival reading rooms where the actual research happens, is a fiercely contested, methodologically dynamic, perpetually unsettled process of argumentation in which the major conclusions are precisely the things most vigorously under dispute, and in which the findings of 10 years ago are regularly, sometimes dramatically, overturned by the findings of today. Spartan studies, at this particular moment in the early 21st century, is one of the more actively contested fields in ancient history. Not because the basic factor in dispute, the broad outline of what we established in the previous acts, the demographic decline, the Helot system, the ceramic cliff edge, the Battle of Leuctra, these are not seriously contested in the current literature. What is contested, with genuine intellectual energy and genuine methodological innovation, is the interpretation of those facts, what they mean, what they tell us about the internal dynamics of the Spartan state, what they reveal about the people, all the people, not just the Spartiates, who lived inside the system. We're going to spend some time at the working edge tonight, because the working edge is where the story is most alive, and because understanding where the debate currently stands, what questions have been resolved, what questions remain genuinely open, and what new questions have emerged that earlier generations of scholars were not equipped to ask, is essential to understanding why the Spartan mirage is not simply a historical curiosity, but an ongoing intellectual problem with genuine stakes. Begin with the question that has been most significantly reopened in the past 15 years. The question of Helot agency. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model of the Helot system treated the Helots primarily as victims, as a population defined, for analytical purposes, by their subjugation, by what was done to them, by the system that contained them, by the Spartan institutions that managed and exploited and periodically killed them. This was not an unreasonable framework, given the nature of the evidence. Most of what the ancient sources tell us about the Helots concerns precisely those features of their existence, the obligations, the terror, the institutional violence that the Spartan state imposed upon them. But it was, as Nino Luraghi of Princeton University argued in his landmark study, The Ancient Messenians, Constructions of Ethnicity and Memory, published in 2008, a framework that imported assumptions about the passivity of enslaved populations that the evidence, read carefully, does not actually support. Luraghi's argument is worth dwelling on, because it represents a genuine paradigm shift in how the field thinks about the Helot question, a shift that has been productive precisely because it asks a different kind of question than the traditional framework did. The traditional framework asked, what did the Spartans do to the Helots? Luraghi's framework asks, who were the Helots? Not as a class defined by their relationship to the Spartan state, but as a people with their own internal history, their own cultural continuity, their own strategies of identity maintenance under conditions of extreme oppression. The Messenians, the specific population whose conquest and enslavement had provided the original labor force of the Helot system, did not cease to exist as a cultural community when they were enslaved. They maintained, across the centuries of Spartan domination, a sense of Messenian identity sufficiently coherent that when Epaminondas liberated Messenia in 369 BC and founded the new city of Messene, there was a Messenian community to receive that liberation. There were people who knew they were Messenians, who had maintained that knowledge across generations of subjugation, who were able to reconstitute a civic identity rapidly enough to build, within a generation, one of the most impressive urban centers in the classical Greek world. The walls of ancient Messene survive today in a state of preservation that makes them one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in Greece. You do not build those walls if you have spent the previous 3 centuries as a culturally inert population passively absorbing Spartan domination. You build those walls if you have spent the previous 3 centuries carefully, quietly, persistently maintaining the cultural memory and the social networks and the organizational capacity that walls of that quality require. Luraghi's study traces the mechanisms of this maintenance. The cult sites, the religious traditions, the oral historical memory that the Messenians preserved under conditions of extreme external pressure, and the ways in which those mechanisms of preservation intersected with, and sometimes actively exploited, the contradictions of the Spartan system. His argument is careful to distinguish between the things the evidence supports and the things it does not. He is explicit that direct evidence for a Helot internal organization is scarce, and that much of what he argues depends on inference and analogy with other enslaved populations in comparative historical literature. But the inference is solid, and the analytical shift it represents, from Helots as objects of Spartan power to Helots as subjects of their own history, has been widely, if not universally, adopted in the subsequent literature. The implications of this shift are considerable. If the Helots maintained coherent cultural identity and organizational capacity across the centuries of Spartan domination, then the periodic revolts we know occurred were not the spontaneous, disorganized eruptions that the traditional model implied, the pressure valve releasing when the weight of oppression temporarily exceeded the capacity of the terror infrastructure to contain it. They were organized, planned, strategically timed resistance, drawing on accumulated social networks and cultural resources that the Krypteia and the broader apparatus of Spartan state terror were designed specifically to suppress. The earthquake revolt of 464 BC, which we discussed briefly in the context of the Krypteia, looks different through this lens, not as opportunistic chaos exploiting a moment of Spartan weakness, but as a coordinated response to that weakness by a population that had been waiting, maintaining its organizational capacity, watching for precisely this kind of opening. Sit with the implications of that reframing. The revolt was not passive population, suddenly in motion. It was organized resistance by people who had been actively preparing for an opportunity that they were sophisticated enough to recognize when it arrived. This is a different Helot than the one most people carry from the traditional accounts, and it is, the evidence suggests, the more accurate one. The second major development at the current working edge concerns the military reputation of the Spartan phalanx itself. This is a sensitive subject, because the military mythology of Sparta is, in many ways, the load-bearing wall of the entire structure. Dismantle the economic equality claim, as Hodgkinson did, and the structure shakes. Complicate the Helot passivity model, as Luragi did, and the structure develops visible cracks. But question the military supremacy of the Spartan phalanx. Question whether Sparta was actually demonstrably significantly better at organized infantry warfare than its Greek contemporaries, and you are threatening the foundation itself. And yet, this is precisely what a strand of scholarship going back to George Cockwell of Oxford has been arguing, with mounting evidence, for the better part of half a century. George Cockwell published his analysis of Spartan military conservatism and tactical rigidity in a series of articles and book chapters beginning in the 1960s, collected and developed most fully in his book Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, published in 1997. His core claim was this: the Spartan phalanx was not tactically innovative. It was disciplined, certainly. The collective drill, the synchronized movement, the psychological solidarity produced by the agoge and the Syssitia were real military assets. But discipline in the execution of a fixed tactical doctrine is not the same thing as tactical superiority. And the Spartan record in the classical period, examined without the mythological frame, reveals a military establishment that was characteristically inflexible in its approach to novel tactical situations. Leuctra was the most dramatic proof, but it was not the only one. Cockwell documented a pattern of Spartan tactical conventionality across the classical period, a tendency to rely on the same basic deployment, the same basic approach to engagement, the same basic assumptions about how battles were won. That represented, in his analysis, not the supreme refinement of military art, but the military equivalent of a highly polished but fundamentally limited technique. The Spartan army was extraordinarily good at doing one thing, when opponents discovered how to do something else, as Epaminondas discovered at Leuctra, as the Athenians had discovered at Sphacteria in 425 BC, where Athenian light infantry and archers captured a force of 120 Spartiates alive, an event so inconsistent with the myth of Spartan invincibility that Thucydides says the rest of the Greek world found it nearly unbelievable. The Spartan army was exposed as brittle beneath its formidable surface. Cockwell's reception in the field was, for a long time, exactly what you would expect for a scholar making an argument that cut against a 2,500-year-old consensus. He was respected. He was read. He was argued with. And he was, by the senior figures of the field in the 1960s and 70s, largely set aside, treated as a provocative but ultimately unconvincing dissenter from the established position that Sparta's military dominance in the classical period was genuine, substantial, and a legitimate core around which the myth had subsequently been elaborated. The subsequent work in ancient military history has, over the past 30 years, moved steadily and substantially in his direction. The development of what historians call the new military history of antiquity, drawing on military logistics analysis, biomechanical modeling of phalanx formations, comparative studies of ancient infantry tactics across multiple cultures, and a systematic re-examination of battle accounts in ancient sources against the physical geography of the sites where those battles occurred, has produced a picture of ancient Greek warfare that sits very poorly with the myth of Spartan tactical supremacy. The work of Adrian Goldsworthy, whose doctoral thesis at Oxford on Roman military history developed analytical methods subsequently applied to Greek warfare by several of his contemporaries, helped establish the framework. The work of Philip Sabin of King's College London on ancient battle simulation and tactical modeling, developed in his book Lost Battles published in 2007, provided quantitative tools for evaluating ancient tactical claims against logistical realities. What these analytical approaches consistently find, when applied to the Spartan military record, is an army that was genuinely superior in unit cohesion and collective drill to most of its classical Greek contemporaries, but that operated within a tactical framework so rigid and conventional that any opponent who could maintain coherent formation while doing something the Spartans had not prepared for could defeat it. The Spartan phalanx was, in the language of modern military analysis, a highly optimized system with a very narrow operational envelope, devastating within that envelope, brittle outside it. And the people who said this first, who said it clearly on the record in published work, before the methodological tools existed to confirm it definitively, were told by their peers that they were wrong. They were not wrong. There is a particular satisfaction in watching the historical discipline correct itself on this point. A satisfaction that is not about scoring intellectual points against the defenders of an old consensus, but about the demonstration that the process works, that evidence, patiently accumulated and carefully argued, does eventually prevail against institutional resistance, that the history of historical scholarship, examined honestly, shows a discipline capable of genuine self-correction, even on questions where the cultural and emotional investment in the established view is very high. This is a satisfaction that good scholarship earns by being patient. The third frontier of current Spartan research concerns a question that, in some ways, sits closest to the center of everything we've been examining tonight. The question of the Spartan sources themselves. We have noted throughout this investigation that the absence of Spartan self-documentation is a fundamental epistemological problem of the field. That everything we know about Sparta comes from outsiders with their own political and cultural motivations, and that this creates an irremediable uncertainty about how closely our picture of Sparta corresponds to historical reality. What recent scholarship has begun to do, with increasing methodological sophistication, is ask a more precise version of this question. Not simply, how distorted is our picture of Sparta, but where specifically are the distortions? Which claims in the ancient sources about Spartan institutions and practices have the best evidential support, and which are most likely to reflect the ideological needs of the sources rather than the historical reality of the society they purport to describe. This is a project associated most closely with the Sparta Reconsidered initiative, an ongoing collaborative research effort involving scholars from multiple European and American universities, which has produced a series of collected volumes and individual studies over the past 2 decades systematically re-examining the ancient evidence for specific Spartan institutions. The project's methodological approach is, in the best sense, conservative. It refuses to accept claims about Spartan institutions simply because those claims appear in ancient sources, and it refuses to reject claims simply because those sources have known ideological motivations. Instead, it applies consistent evidentiary standards, asking, for each specific claim, what other evidence exists to corroborate or challenge it, what the ideological incentives of the source were in making it, and what the claim implies about other aspects of Spartan society that can be independently evaluated. The results are predictably mixed, in the productive sense that mixed results are always more informative than clean ones. Some features of the Spartan myth that scholars have been inclined to dismiss as laconiphile invention turn out, on close examination, to have better evidential support than expected. Others that have been accepted as reliable tradition collapse, on the same examination, into the category of literary construction with no independent support. The agoge is a useful example. The basic existence of the agoge, a systematic, state-organized educational program for Spartan male youth, is not seriously doubted. The evidence for it is sufficiently diverse and sufficiently consistent across sources with different ideological orientations that its reality is as well established as anything in Spartan history can be. What is contested is the character and content of the agoge, the dramatic features that populate popular accounts, the deliberate starvation as a test of resourcefulness, the ritual theft, the systematic beating, appear primarily in late sources, most notably Plutarch writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Several centuries after classical agoge have been substantially reformed by the Hellenistic kings of Sparta. The honest answer, which the Sparta reconsidered scholarship have been arguing with some force, is that our most vivid and specific accounts of the agoge describe a Hellenistic institution that had been consciously theatricalized, made more dramatic, more extreme, more visually arresting, for the benefit of Roman tourists who visited Sparta in the 1st centuries BC and AD and expected and were apparently provided with a performance of Spartan savagery that served the tourist economy of a city that had, by then, nothing much else to sell. The classical agoge was real. The agoge of Plutarch's description was, at least in significant part, a tourist attraction. Sit with the layers of that for a moment. The most lurid and specific details of the Spartan training system, the details that have been reproduced in film and fiction and inspirational rhetoric for 2 centuries, derive primarily from accounts of a performance designed for Roman visitors who wanted to see something that matched the stories they had already heard. The mirage was not just literary. It was eventually theatrical. It was staged for paying audiences by a city that had learned to monetize its own legend because the legend was the only durable product it had left. There is one more development at the current research frontier that deserves careful attention, because it concerns a figure we have not yet discussed directly, and whose absence from the standard accounts of Spartan history tells us something important about the nature of the mirage itself. The Spartan women. The women of Sparta occupy a peculiar position in the mythological tradition. They are, in one sense, among the most celebrated features of the Spartan system. Their relative freedom, their physical education, their supposed authority in the domestic sphere, their famous laconic wit in sending sons to war. Gorgo, the wife of the Spartan king Leonidas, is the most frequently cited example. Asked by a foreign woman how Spartan women alone could rule their men, she is said to have replied, "Because we alone give birth to men." The line is perfect. It is a verbal equivalent of the kylix painting. Compact, aesthetically complete, emotionally resonant, designed to be remembered and repeated. And it is almost certainly not something Gorgo actually said. The story appears in Plutarch, writing 6 centuries after Gorgo's lifetime, in a collection of famous sayings attributed to Spartan women that reads, by the standards of modern source criticism, as exactly what it is: a literary anthology of exemplary laconic wit, assembled to illustrate a point about Spartan character, drawing on oral tradition that had been in circulation for centuries and that had been polished, by that circulation, into the kind of lapidary perfection that actual speech almost never achieves. The recent scholarship on Spartan women, most significantly the work of Sarah Pomeroy of the City University of New York, whose study Spartan women was published in 2002, and the subsequent work of scholars, including Lynn Foxhall of the University of Leicester, has done for the question of Spartan women what Hodgkinson did for the question of Spartan economic equality, subjected the literary tradition to systematic source criticism, separated the evidentially supported from the ideologically constructed, and produced a picture that is at once more complicated and more interesting than the myth allows. What emerges is a Spartan female experience that was genuinely different from the Athenian model: more physical education, more legal capacity, more public presence, but that was also more constrained in specific ways than the myth suggests. The freedom of Spartan women was not an expression of Spartan progressive values. It was, like so much else in the Spartan system, functional. Women who were physically fit produced healthier children. Women who managed estates effectively freed their husbands for military service. Women who had internalized the civic values of the system and transmitted those values to their sons were assets to the state. The Spartan woman was free in the ways that made her useful to the system. In the ways that threatened the system, political participation, financial independence, the ability to challenge the ideological framework, she was as constrained as women elsewhere. Pomeroy's work, and the subsequent scholarship it generated, has begun to fill in one of the significant gaps in the picture of Spartan society that the Mirage had left blank. Not with certainty. The evidential problems that afflict all Spartan history afflict the history of Spartan women with particular force, because the ancient sources were even less interested in the interior lives of Spartan women than they were in the interior lives of Helots. But with enough precision to demonstrate that the mythological version is inadequate and that the actual version, recovered with difficulty from behind the mythology, is worth the effort of recovery. The epistemological position we occupy in the mid-21st century with respect to Sparta is genuinely strange. We know more than any previous generation of scholars. Our archaeological methods are more precise, our isotopic analyses more informative, our demographic modeling more sophisticated, our source-critical tools more refined. We have more data about the Spartan world than Ollier had in 1933, and vastly more than a Roman tourist who watched a staged version of the agoge in the 1st century AD. And yet the fundamental problem, the absence of Spartan voices, has not been solved. It has been more precisely mapped. We know now, with a specificity that earlier scholarship did not have, exactly where the gaps are. We know which questions the evidence cannot answer, and we know this with precision that allows us to be useful about it. To say not just that Sparta is poorly documented, but that the agoge is better documented than the Cryptia, the citizen class is better documented than the Helots, the military institutions are better documented than the religious ones, the 5th century BC is better documented than the 8th century or the 3rd. The better our tools become, the more precisely we can map the shape of what we are missing. Sit with that for a moment. The shape of the silence. The outline of the absence, rendered in higher and higher resolution by the improving precision of our methods for measuring what is not there. This is, in a strange way, a form of progress, not the progress of filling the gap. That gap may never be filled, given the deliberate Spartan suppression of the evidence that would fill it, but the progress of understanding the gap accurately, of knowing precisely what we do not know, which is the epistemological foundation on which any honest engagement with the past must rest. We do not know what the Helots called their children. We do not know what songs were sung at Helot weddings, what gods were prayed to in Helot households, what stories were told to Helot children about the world before the conquest. We know that these things existed, because they always exist, because human communities do not survive across centuries without the cultural resources that names and songs and prayers and stories provide. We know they existed. We cannot hear them. And the quiet that fills its space is the truest, most honest, and most haunting sound in all of Spartan history. Not the clash of the phalanx at Thermopylae, not the laconic wit of Gorgo, not the grinding discipline of the agoge, or the secret movement of young men on the high ridges of Taygetos in the dark. This quiet, this particular, specific, irretrievable quiet, that is the sound the Mirage was built to cover. And it is still covering it right now, in the present day, in ways that are worth looking at directly before we are done. The road to Thermopylae is a good road now. 4 lanes of modern asphalt, maintained by the Greek Ministry of Infrastructure, carrying freight trucks and tourist coaches and rental cars between Athens and Thessaloniki along the eastern coast of central Greece. The drive from Athens takes approximately 2.5 hours under normal traffic conditions. The landscape along the route is not dramatic for most of the journey. The Boeotian plain, flat and agricultural, the kind of terrain that does not announce itself, that asks nothing of the traveler except the patience to cross it. And then, roughly 220 kilometers north of Athens, the road approaches the coast and the mountains close in from the west and the Malian Gulf opens to the east, and you are, technically, at Thermopylae. The first thing most visitors notice is the highway. The second thing, if they are paying attention to the geography rather than looking for the memorial statues, is that the pass is not particularly narrow. This requires a moment of explanation, because it is one of those facts that is simultaneously well established in the scholarly literature and almost entirely absent from popular accounts of the battle, and the absence is itself instructive. In 480 BC, the coastal shelf at this point, the strip of level ground between the sea and the cliffs of the Kylix range, was, by ancient accounts, narrow enough at its most constricted point that a wagon could barely pass. Some accounts suggest widths of only a few meters at the narrowest section. This geography was the entire tactical premise of the Spartan defense. A narrow front that neutralized the numerical advantage of the Persian force by limiting the width of the line that could actually be engaged at any given moment. The coastal shelf is no longer a few meters wide. Millennia of river sedimentation from the Sparkios River, which enters the sea just west of the pass, have deposited enough material to push the coastline several kilometers seaward from its ancient position. The geographic feature that made the Battle of Thermopylae tactically possible, the narrow waste of land between cliff and sea, has been buried under its own accumulated sediment. Where Leonidas and his 300 stood, there is now a broad agricultural coastal plain, flat and open, extending east toward a shoreline that the warriors of 480 BC would not have recognized. Even the landscape of the myth has changed. The monument is still there, a bronze statue of Leonidas, erected in 1955 on the initiative of the Greek government, stands at the edge of the highway on a stone base inscribed with a famous epitaph, rendered in modern Greek lettering. The warriors pose the drama that the myth requires. Spear upraised, helmet in place, the absolute physical confidence of man who has decided that the question of whether he will survive has already been answered, and that this frees him completely for the business of fighting. The tourists photograph it. They photograph it with the highway visible in the background, with the tour coaches parked in the lay-by, with a flat coastal plain extending behind the statue to the sea. Some of them hold their phones at angles that minimize the modern infrastructure in the frame, that isolate the statue against the sky or the cliffs, that produce an image sufficiently ancient-looking to carry the emotional weight the site is supposed to carry. This is not dishonesty. It is the ordinary human work of narrative maintenance, the instinctive editing of reality that we perform whenever the evidence threatens to interrupt a story we need to be true. Stand here quietly for a moment. The Sparkios Valley opens to the west, the mountains rising behind it. The Malian Gulf lies to the east, the water catching the afternoon light with the absolute indifference of bodies of water to the significance that human events have attempted to invest in their shores. Below you, beneath the sediment of 25 centuries, the geography of the battle that made Sparta's myth immortal is buried so completely that it cannot be seen. The landscape has, quite literally, covered the event, and what stands in the event's place is a story. A story so completely separated by now from any specific physical or historical anchor that it can be picked up and carried anywhere, that it can be made to mean almost anything, that it has been made across 25 centuries to mean an extraordinary range of things, most of which the men who fought here would not have recognized, and some of which would have struck them as not simply foreign, but actively incomprehensible. We need to follow the story, all the way to where it currently lives. The journey of the Spartan myth through Western history is not a straight line. It does not travel from the ancient world to the modern one on a single vector, gaining velocity and coherence as it moves. It travels more like a river, branching, pooling in certain historical moments, going underground for periods and re-emerging change, finding its way around obstacles, always following the gradient of cultural need rather than the gradient of historical accuracy. In the Roman world, the myth found its first major new home among the Stoic philosophers, who adopted Spartan austerity as a model for the philosophical program of indifference to comfort and appetite that Stoicism required as its ethical foundation. The Spartan who ate black broth without complaint, who endured physical hardship without flinching, who regarded death as a matter of indifference. This figure was exactly what Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius needed for their philosophical project, and they used it accordingly, without excessive concern for whether the historical Sparta had actually produced human beings who corresponded to the description. The Roman aristocracy, meanwhile, developed a tourist relationship with Sparta that we noted briefly in the previous act, a pilgrimage to the site of a legendary austerity that provided the same kind of pleasurable self-improvement narrative that wealthy people in every era find in contact with apparent simplicity. They visited the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia and watched the theatrical version of the agoge. They wrote letters home describing the experience with a particular register of appreciative condescension that characterizes the well-traveled wealthy encountering cultures they admire from a safe distance of both geography and social status. Plutarch, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries AD, drew on this tradition to produce the lives and the collections of Spartan sayings that would become, for later centuries, the primary quarry from which the Spartan myth was extracted and reshaped. Plutarch was a serious scholar, a genuinely learned man with a genuine interest in historical accuracy. He was also writing 6 centuries after the events he described, in a Roman cultural environment that had strong appetites for the kind of exemplary moral biography that the Spartan tradition provided. His Sparta is a composite. Some real historical tradition, substantially elaborated and dramatized, passed through the filter of his own moral and philosophical concerns, and written for an audience that wanted its history to be improving rather than merely informative. His Leonidas is heroic. His Lycurgus is wise. His Spartan women are laconic and noble. His Helots barely appear. This Plutarchan Sparta traveled through the medieval period in the baggage of classical education, arriving in the Renaissance with the authority that antiquity automatically conferred, and the particular prestige of having been endorsed by writers as various as Cicero, Horace, and the New Testament, which contains no mention of Sparta, but whose early Christian interpreters sometimes found in Spartan communalism a pre-echo of apostolic community. The Enlightenment found Sparta indispensable. Jean-Jacques Rousseau drew on the Spartan model for his critique of luxury and his idealization of civic virtue. The Spartan rejection of wealth and comfort fitted perfectly into his argument that civilization was corrupting and that simpler, more austere forms of social organization were morally superior. His Sparta was as historically thin as Plutarch's, and considerably more politically charged, because Rousseau was not writing antiquarian biography. He was writing political philosophy with a specific, urgent contemporary argument, and the Spartan myth provided the historical precedent his argument needed. The Abbé de Mably drew on Sparta to argue for radical equality. Mably's Sparta was a communist utopia avant la lettre, a society that solved the problem of wealth inequality by eliminating private property, which is not what Sparta did, as Hodgkinson would demonstrate 2 centuries later, but which is what the myth said Sparta did, and which served Mably's argument precisely because of what it said rather than because of what happened. The leaders of the French Revolution made Sparta their secular patron state. The Jacobins, in the most violent phase of the terror, invoked Spartan models of civic sacrifice and collective discipline with frequency and an intensity that tells you everything you need to know about the relationship between political extremism and the weaponization of historical myth. Robespierre, addressing the National Convention, described the revolution's task in terms that drew explicitly on the Spartan example: the necessity of subordinating individual interest to collective virtue, of accepting sacrifice as a price of a pure and uncompromised civic order. The blood that followed was real. The Sparta it invoked was not. The 19th century added a new dimension to the myth's political utility: racial science. The development of scientific racism in the mid-19th century, the attempt to systematize the folk categories of racial hierarchy into a rigorous biological framework, required historical precedents for the proposition that racial purity was a social good and racial mixing a source of cultural decline. Sparta provided them. The myth of Spartan eugenics, the exposure of weak infants on the slopes of Taygetos, the selective breeding of the warrior class, was adapted into the vocabulary of 19th century racial science with facility that depended entirely on the myth's plasticity and the scientific community's indifference to the actual historical evidence. The infant exposure story appears in Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, and its historical reliability is genuinely uncertain. Modern scholars are divided on whether it describes an actual Spartan practice or a literary elaboration of philosophical ideals. The honest answer is that we do not know with confidence how frequently, if at all, the practice occurred in classical Sparta, and that the ancient evidence is contradictory and ideologically loaded in ways that make definitive conclusions extremely difficult. The 19th century racial scientists were not interested in these qualifications. They were interested in the precedent. And by the early 20th century, the connection between Spartan imagery and racial ideology had been established in the European political imagination with a firmness that would produce, in the 1930s and 40s, consequences of a magnitude and a horror that François Ollier was already watching develop we sat down to write Le Mirage Spartiate in 1933. Adolf Hitler's admiration for Sparta was explicit, documented, and programmatic. He expressed it in Main Camps, published in 1925, where he described Sparta as the first folkiest state in history, a state that had, in his reading, understood the necessity of maintaining racial purity through eugenic selection, and had organized its entire civic apparatus around that understanding. His Sparta was Plutarch's Sparta filtered through the racial science of the late 19th century, stripped of any remaining nuance, and deployed as historical validation for a program of mass murder. The Spartan warrior as a symbol appeared in National Socialist imagery with a regularity that established it as a conscious, deliberate point of reference, not a casual classical allusion, but a specific claim of historical lineage, an argument that what the Third Reich was attempting had precedent in the ancient world's most celebrated martial civilization. Mussolini's Italy made similar use of classical imagery, though with a preference for Roman over Spartan references that reflected the different historical geography of Italian nationalism. But the Spartan resonances were present in Italian fascist rhetoric as well, particularly in the idealization of collective sacrifice, physical discipline, and the subordination of the individual to the state, concepts for which the Spartan myth, in its standard abbreviated form, provided exactly the language needed. The consequences of this weaponization are too well known to require detailed description here. What matters for our purposes is the mechanism. The myth did not become dangerous in the 1930s because it suddenly became false. It had always been false, or substantially false, in the ways that Alia was documenting at exactly the moment the danger was peaking. It became dangerous because it was available, because it had been traveling, in its politically plastic, evidentially unconstrained form, for 25 centuries, picking up authority with each new century of use, accumulating the prestige of apparent antiquity, and remaining flexible enough to adapt to each new political context it encountered. The myth was dangerous because it worked, because the emotional core, the small number against a vast number, the sacrifice freely chosen, the disciplined collective over the corrupted individual, the warrior who fears nothing because he has given up everything that could be taken, remained as available and as potent in 1933 as it had been when the Athenian painter put it on the inside of a drinking cup in 414 BC. It worked on intelligent people. It worked on educated people. It worked on people who had, in many cases, read the ancient sources, and who therefore had access, in principle, to the evidence of the mirage. It worked anyway, because emotional architecture, when it is sufficiently well built, is not dismantled by the presentation of contrary evidence. It is dismantled, if it is dismantled at all, by a sustained, patient, careful process of reframing that operates at the same emotional register as the myth itself. That tells a different story with equal vividness, equal specificity, equal attention to the human scale of what it is describing. This is, in part, what we have been attempting tonight. The journey continues into the present. The use of Spartan imagery in contemporary extremist politics is a documented, studied, actively monitored phenomenon, and it is worth being specific about what that monitoring has found, because vagueness here would be a form of minimization that the evidence does not support. The lambda symbol, the inverted V, the letter lambda in the Greek alphabet, which appeared on the shields of Lacedaemonian soldiers, and which have become, in popular culture, the primary visual shorthand for Spartan identity, is currently listed in the symbol databases maintained by the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism as a symbol used by certain white nationalist and neo-fascist communities, particularly in online spaces. The listing is careful and appropriately qualified. The lambda is not exclusively or even primarily an extremist symbol, and the ADL's methodology distinguishes between symbols used by extremists and symbols that are inherently extremist, a distinction that matters enormously for civil liberties reasons, and that the Anti-Defamation League takes seriously in its published guidance. The distinction is real. The use is also real. The program on extremism at George Washington University, which has been producing research on domestic extremism since 2015 under the direction of Lorenzo Vidino, has documented the use of Spartan imagery in the online recruiting and branding of several far-right groups. The imagery functions, in these contexts, not as a detailed historical reference, but as an aesthetic, a visual grammar of warrior masculinity, discipline, violence, and civilizational sacrifice that carries an emotional payload without requiring any specific historical knowledge from the person consuming it. The Global Network on Extremism and Technology, known as GNET, an academic research consortium affiliated with the International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College London, has published analyses of how classical military imagery functions in online extremist recruitment, how the visual language of idealized warrior culture is used to create aspirational identity for young men experiencing social dislocation, and how that visual language draws specifically on the particular version of Spartan aesthetics that has been circulating in popular culture since the release of Zack Snyder's film 300 in 2007. That film deserves a moment of attention because it is the most significant single contribution to the popularization of the Spartan myth in the early 21st century, and because its relationship to both the historical evidence and the contemporary political appropriation of Spartan imagery is genuinely complicated. 300 is not, by any reasonable assessment, a historically accurate film. Its makers did not claim it was. It is an adaptation of Frank Miller's graphic novel of the same name, itself a highly stylized work of visual fiction that drew on the myth rather than the history with complete self-consciousness about the distinction. The film Sparta is the myth Sparta, the idealized warrior bodies, the laconic dialogue, the noble sacrifice, the vast barbarian horde against the disciplined few, rendered with a visual excess that makes its fictional nature almost impossible to miss. And yet, the visual vocabulary it established, the specific aesthetic of hypermuscular Spartan warriors in minimal armor, the red cloaks, the shields, the particular posture of disciplined readiness that the film's production designers developed from a combination of classical sources and contemporary bodybuilding aesthetics, became, almost immediately upon the film's release, the dominant visual reference for Spartan identity in popular culture. In gyms and military subculture, in online communities organized around ideals of masculine physical development and warrior identity, the imagery of 300 replaced the imagery of the ancient sources with completeness that would have satisfied the Spartan state's most ambitious information management officer. The people who adopted this imagery, the vast majority of them, did so for reasons that have nothing to do with extremism. They found in it an aesthetic that spoke to genuine aspirations, physical discipline, collective solidarity, the willingness to sacrifice comfort for a higher purpose. These are not inherently dangerous values. They are, in most contexts, benign or actively constructive. The concern documented by the researchers at the Program on Extremism and at GNET is not that interest in Spartan aesthetics is inherently radicalizing. It is that the same imagery, the same aesthetic vocabulary, the same emotional architecture is used in the early stages of certain online radicalization pathways, that it functions as a point of aesthetic entry into communities whose subsequent content is considerably more specific and considerably more dangerous than a film about ancient Greece. The myth is plastic. It always has been. In benign contexts, its plasticity allows it to carry aspirational values, discipline, sacrifice, collective commitment, in a form that is emotionally engaging and historically validated by apparent antiquity. In malign contexts, exactly the same plasticity allows the same imagery to be inflected with racial ideology, with the glorification of organized violence, with the specific political program of groups whose agenda has nothing to do with ancient Greece and everything to do with the present. The flag and the logo and the tattoo all look the same. The content that follows them does not. There are broader dimensions of the myth's current life that operate at a lower intensity, but a wider distribution than the extremist appropriations, and they are worth naming because they are more likely to be the dimension of the myth that most people encounter in their own experience. The use of Spartan rhetoric in elite athletic training culture, in the marketing language of endurance sports, high-intensity fitness programs, military preparation regimens, is now so pervasive that it has become essentially invisible. The names of fitness programs, the marketing copy of sports nutrition companies, the motivational language of athletic coaches from the youth level to professional, all of it draws, continuously and almost without self-awareness, on a vocabulary of austerity and collective discipline, and a subordination of comfort to purpose that is recognizably Spartan in its ancestry. Most of the people using this language have no conscious awareness of its origins. Most of them, if asked, would not be able to describe the actual structure of the agoge, or the demographic crisis of oliganthropia, or the relationship between the Syssitia and the Helot labor system. They are using the myth in the same way that the Athenian symposiasts used a drinking cup, not as a reference to a historical reality, but as an invocation of a certain emotional register, a certain quality of seriousness and discipline and collective commitment that the myth has come, through 25 centuries of use, to symbolize. This is not in itself dangerous, but it is in itself worth noticing. Because the same emotional register that motivates a marathon runner or a military cadet or an athlete pushing through an exhausting training session also motivates the political movements that have, in every century since Rousseau, found in the Spartan myth the historical precedent their programs required. The emotional architecture is the same. The application varies. And the pathway from one to the other is shorter and less well-marked than most people who occupy the benign end of the spectrum would be comfortable acknowledging. The historian Barry Strauss of Cornell University, in his study The Battle of Salamis, published in 2004, makes an observation about the afterlife of ancient military mythology that is directly relevant here. He notes that the myths we inherit from the ancient world carry their emotional cargo across the centuries without carrying the ethical context that gave that cargo its original meaning, that we receive the feeling of the myth without the specific human situation in which the feeling was originally embedded, and that this decontextualization is precisely what makes ancient myths so adaptable and so, in certain circumstances, so dangerous. We receive the warrior. We do not receive the helot. We receive the sacrifice. We do not receive the structural terror that made the sacrifice necessary. We receive the crimson cloak and the laconic wit and the noble last stand. We do not receive the young man moving through dark fields with a knife. And until we insist on receiving both, until we refuse to accept the warrior without the system that produced him, the sacrifice without the slavery that funded it, the myth without the mirage, we remain, in our relationship to the Spartan tradition, exactly where the Athenian painter was in 414 BC, painting a figure on the inside of a drinking cup, confident in our portrait, having never left home. None of the contemporary appropriations of Spartan imagery represents, in isolation, an existential threat. The fitness culture use is benign. The military culture use is mixed, producing, in most cases, nothing more than a motivation of vocabulary that soldiers find useful and that does not, in most cases, translate into political ideology. The extremist use is the most concerning, but it is also, by the measurement of the researchers who track it most carefully, a phenomenon of relatively limited scale, significant enough to warrant monitoring, not significant enough, at present, to constitute a major national security concern. The concern is not the present. It is the trajectory. Myths that have traveled as far as this one has traveled, that have survived the fall of the civilization they described, the conversion of Europe to a monotheism that regarded pagan military virtue with ambivalence, the medieval centuries in which classical learning was preserved primarily in monastic libraries, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, and the digital revolution. Such myths do not become less available with the passage of time. They become more embedded, more automatic, more resistant to correction. Because each century of use adds another layer of apparent validation, another set of cultural references that treat the myth as established background rather than contested claim. The Spartan myth is not declining. It is propagating across new media, in new languages, to new audiences who encounter it without the historical context that might allow them to evaluate it, in a global information environment that rewards emotionally compelling over the evidentially supported with consistency that would not have surprised the Spartan state, whose entire information management strategy was premised on precisely this understanding of how reputation travels. The people who built the Mirage understood something fundamental about human psychology. They understood it 2,500 years ago, without the benefit of modern communications theory or cognitive science. They understood that the emotional image travels faster and farther than the corrective fact, that the story of the 300 will always reach more people than the story of the 2,000 Helots, that Thucydides describes the Spartans killing quietly, in distributed fashion, over a period of time short enough to fall below the threshold of historical visibility. That the crimson cloak will always be more compelling than the bone signatures of agricultural laborers in Peloponnesian grave sites. That the last stand will always be more available than the demographic mathematics of oliganthropia. None of them is an immediate threat. All of them are non-zero risks, on time scales that are short by geological standards and not so very long by human ones. And the only reliable corrective, the only thing that has ever actually worked against a myth that's durable, that's emotionally compelling, that's precisely adapted to the human appetite for clean heroic narrative, is the slow, patient, honest work of replacing it with something better, not simpler, better, truer, more complete, more willing to hold the warrior and the helot in the same frame, to receive the sacrifice and structural terror together, to look at the cup and see not just the painted figure, but the hands that never made it to Sparta, painting something they had never seen and could not have seen from a city that was at war with the city they were painting. This work is not finished. It has not been finished by Ollier, or by Hodkinson, or by Luragi, or by any of the scholars we have met tonight, working patiently in their seminar rooms and their field excavations and their archival reading rooms, mapping the shape of the silence, measuring the contours of the mirage. It will not be finished by this conversation. But conversations are how it proceeds. One careful, honest, patient conversation at a time. In the quiet, in the dark, in the place where the myth was always most powerful, and where, therefore, the truth has always had the most work to do. Pick up the cup again, not as an effort, not as a deliberate act of intellectual recall. Let it come back the way objects come back in a half-dark when you've been sitting with them long enough. Not summoned but present. The weight of something you held for a long time remains in the hands after you have set it down. The kylix, smooth terracotta, cool to the touch, heavier than you expect at the base, and thinning toward the rim with a precision that was not accidental. The two horizontal handles extending symmetrically from the sides, the deep lightless black of the interior, the warm orange red of the attic clay, where the slip thins at the edges. The figure inside the bowl, the warrior, the idealized physique, the Corinthian helmet pushed back from the face, the crimson cloak, the posture of disciplined readiness that someone decided, in a workshop in the Kerameikos district in approximately 414 BC, was what a Spartan looked like. Hold it differently now. Not differently in the sense of rejecting what it is. It is still a beautiful object, still the product of genuine skill, still the work of a craftsman who understood his materials with an intimacy that only years of sustained attention produces. Hold it differently in the sense of holding it fully, of receiving it as the complete thing it actually is, rather than the simplified thing the myth would prefer it to be. It is a drinking cup made in Athens by a man who had never been to Sparta. It is a portrait of a people painted by a hand that had never seen those people. It is a founding document of a tradition of invention that has run, without significant interruption, for 25 centuries. And it is also genuinely a beautiful object. Both things are true simultaneously, and the capacity to hold both things simultaneously, to appreciate the craft without accepting the fiction, to see the beauty without mistaking for evidence, is precisely the capacity that the myth, in all its forms, has always been designed to prevent. Because myths do not want to be held fully. They want to be held simply. They want the figure without the context, the sacrifice without the system, the warrior without the helot, the crimson cloak without the young man moving to the dark fields of Messenia with a knife and the authority of the state behind him. They want the bowl of the cup without the hands that could not make the journey to see the thing they were painting. We have spent tonight trying to do the harder thing. The man who originally held this cup, the Athenian symposiast, reclining on his client in some well-appointed room while the lamplight caught the painted figure inside the bowl as he tilted it back, was dreaming of a Sparta that did not exist. Not foolishly, not through any failure of intelligence or education or critical capacity. He was dreaming the dream that the available evidence supported, because the available evidence had been shaped by both Spartan information management and Athenian political need. To produce exactly that dream, he was, in the best sense of the word, deceived. Not by a single lie, but by the accumulated weight of 1,000 smaller decisions. The xenolasia that kept him from seeing Lacedaemon directly. The oral tradition that prevented the creation of a corrective documentary record. The Laconophile philosophers whose political needs made them enthusiastic architects of the fiction. The Spartan state's own careful management of its reputation as its primary military asset. He tilted the cup back. The wine was good. The room was warm. The music from the Aulos in the corner was the kind of music that Alcman might once have composed for choral performance at a Laconian festival, before the workshops closed, before the bird bowls stopped traveling, before the valley turned inward and the culture burned itself down to make room for the garrison. He looked at the figure. He saw a Spartan. He saw discipline and austerity and collective virtue and the subordination of the individual self to the demands of the warrior community. He saw the clean, heroic thing. The thing that Athens, exhausted and traumatized by 16 years of war against the people the figure represented, both feared and desired in a particular way that rivals fear and desire each other, wanting the other's strength without wanting the other's reality, wanting the story without wanting the truth of the system that produced it. He drank. He set the cup down. He did not think about the demographic mathematics of oliganthropia, because no one had yet done that mathematics. He did not think about the cliff-edge silence of the Laconian ceramic workshops, because no one had yet developed the stratigraphic methods that would read that silence. He did not think about the bone signatures of agricultural laborers in Peloponnesian grave sites, because that methodology would not exist for another 2,500 years. He thought about the figure. He thought, there is something there, something that we have lost or never had, something that the painted warrior in the bowl represents, that clean and absolute dedication to a single purpose, that indifference to the soft corruptions of wealth and comfort, that willingness to stand in a narrow place and hold it against everything. And he was right, in a way. There is something there. The tragedy is not that he was entirely wrong to feel it. The tragedy is that the something there was so different from what he thought it was, that what produced a figure on the cup, what produced a warrior, the discipline, the collective austerity, the willingness to die in a narrow place, was not a noble civic philosophy freely chosen by a community of equals. It was a structural terror of the garrison state, trapped by its own foundational decision, spending itself generation by generation in the management of a crisis it had no mechanism to resolve, producing warriors because warriors were the only thing that stood between the Spartan citizen class and the arithmetic of their own situation. The discipline was real. The nobility of its origins was the story. And the distance between those two things, the reality of the discipline and the fiction of its nobility, is the precise distance that the mirage occupies. The space between what was and what was said about what was. The space that Francois Ollier named in 1933, and that Stephen Hodgkinson spent 2 decades mapping, and that a generation of scholars before and after them have been patiently, carefully, honestly attempting to illuminate. Not to eliminate the Spartan achievement. It was an achievement of a real and formidable kind, even if its nature was not what the myth describes. But to see it clearly, to see it whole, the Laconian hound is gone. Not the breed entirely. The modern Laconian hound, recognized by the Kennel Club of Greece as a distinct breed, is still bred in the southern Peloponnese, and there are records of it in the agricultural villages of Laconia, lean and long-legged and adapted to the specific terrain of the Eurotas Valley, bred by people who understand this landscape with the intimate, generational knowledge that sustained attention produces. But the hound of the 7th century, the one that ran through fields of wild thyme and asphodel in a valley that had not yet become a garrison, the one that Alcman might watch from a hillside while composing a choral ode about the quality of light on the river, that specific animal, in that specific moment, in that specific unconstricted valley, is irretrievably gone. What remains is what always remains when a specific moment passes. The things that were made in it, the traces it left in the archaeological record, the fragments of written language that happened to survive, and the stories that were told about it by people who were not there, shaped by the needs of their own moment rather than the reality of the moment they were describing. What remains is the cup, and the cup, as we have established, is not evidence of Sparta. It is evidence of what Athens needed Sparta to be, which is, in its way, evidence of something just as important. Something about the universal human hunger for the clean story, the legible hero, the simple answer to the question of what it looks like when a community gets it right, when the discipline is genuine, and the sacrifice is meaningful, and the collective overcomes the individual not through coercion, but through freely chosen, deeply felt, nobly expressed commitment. We want the story to be true. We have always wanted it. The wanting is not a failure. The wanting is human, which is to say it is complicated and understandable and worthy of respect, and also, in specific circumstances, extremely dangerous. The failure, if there is one, is not in wanting the story. The failure is in accepting the story as the evidence, when the evidence tells a different and harder and more important story than the one we wanted. Here is the story the evidence tells. A city in a fertile river valley, in a warm Mediterranean climate, in the 7th century before the Common Era, produced poetry and bronze work in fine ceramics, and a celebrated breed of hunting dog and choral music composed for mixed-gender public performance, and a trading relationship with the wider Mediterranean world that carried its goods as far as the shores of the Etruscan settlements of central Italy. That city made a decision. The decision was not unique in the ancient world. Conquest and enslavement were normal features of ancient Greek interstate relations, but the scale of the decision and the completeness with which it trapped the society that made it were exceptional. The subjugation of Messenia committed Lacedaemon to a permanent internal security crisis from which it never escaped, could never escape, because the only available responses to that crisis, intensified military organization, political closure, cultural contraction, the systematic management of information, all deepened the trap rather than resolving it. The city burned its own culture to fuel the security apparatus. The poetry stopped traveling. The workshops went quiet. The bird bowls stopped being loaded onto trading ships. And in the space that the culture vacated, the myth moved in, not all at once, not by any single decision, gradually, iteratively, through the accumulation of thousands of individual acts of invention and omission and selective emphasis and political need. In the Athenian academies and the Roman Stoic schools and the medieval monasteries and the Renaissance courts and Enlightenment salons and the fascist propaganda ministries and the online communities of the early 21st century, the myth of Sparta assembled itself from the ruins of the city it described, and it became, eventually, more real than the city had ever been. More real in the sense of more widely believed, more emotionally available, more politically useful, more present, in the minds of people encountering the word Spartan for the first time, than any accurate historical account could hope to be, because the myth had 25 centuries of refinement behind it, and the accurate historical account has at most 200 years of careful scholarship, and at most a few hours of your attention on a quiet night. The myth has the advantage. It always has the advantage. But here is what the scholarship of the last century has demonstrated, patiently and cumulatively, with the kind of evidence that accumulates rather than announces itself. The advantage is not permanent. Myths can be read. Their mechanisms can be identified. Their political functions can be described. The specific human beings who built them, the Xenophons and the Platonists and the Spartan ephors who managed access, and the French scholars who named the mirage, and the quiet English historians who spent 20 years mapping its economic foundations, can be named and understood and placed in the intellectual tradition they belong to. The myth can be held up to the light, not dissolved, not eliminated. The Spartan myth will outlast this documentary and the scholarship it draws on, and everyone listening to it, and probably many generations of people who have not yet been born. It is not going anywhere. It is too well built, too emotionally precise, too perfectly adapted to a need that is not going away. But it can be held up to the light. And in the light, it is possible to see the hands behind it. The Athenian painter's hands, steady and skilled, painting a figure he had never seen, in a city at war with the city he was painting. And behind those hands, behind the cup, behind the figure in the bowl, and the single word beneath it, Lakedaimonios, the actual place, the actual valley, the actual river, moving slowly south between banks of oleander and plane trees, carrying the snowmelt of Mount Tigitos in a season that Alcman, who was alive to see it, found worth writing about. That valley is still there. The river is still there. The mountain is still there, carrying its cold and its silence and its ancient limestone paths that the young men of the Cryptea used to move through the dark. The hound still runs, somewhere in the agricultural villages of Laconia, through terrain that is not so different from what it was. And below all of it, beneath the layers of myth and scholarship and the Bavarian grit of the modern streets and the Ottoman centuries before them and the Byzantine silence before those, beneath all the accumulated weight of what the place became and what was said about it, and what was never said about it, and what cannot now be said because the voices that might have said it were never given the instruments of record. Beneath all of it, the actual city, the actual people, the Helot farmer, whose name we will never know, and the Spartan citizen trapped in the collective organism of the state, and the poet who wrote about the quality of light on the river before the workshops went quiet. Sit with them for a moment, not the myth, them, the people who were actually there in the actual valley, living the actual complicated, morally ambiguous, structurally constrained, historically irreducible lives that the myth replaced with something cleaner and simpler and more emotionally satisfying and less true. They were there. They did not know they would become a myth. They did not know that 25 centuries after their valley went quiet, someone in a very different world, speaking a very different language, in circumstances they could not have imagined, would be piecing together the evidence of their lives from bone signatures and ceramic distributions, and the passing references of writers who visited them once or never and wrote down what they thought they saw. They did not know. They just lived in the valley, with the river, under the mountain, inside the system, for better and worse, and everything in between that life actually contains when you are in it rather than looking back at it from a sufficient distance to mistake the outline for the whole. The cup settles now. Let it find its place at the bottom of the past, where it has been resting undisturbed, for the most part, for 25 centuries. Let the wine that stained its interior fade back into the darkness from which we lifted it at the beginning of this conversation. Let the figure in the bowl become just a figure. Skilled, careful, aesthetically accomplished, historically instructive, no longer carrying the impossible weight of civilization's self-image projected across 2.5 millennia. Just a cup, made by a man in a workshop, who knew what he knew, which was not very much about the place he was painting, and who made something beautiful with what he knew, which is all that any of us can do. The honest conclusion, at the end of all this research, at the end of all this careful, patient, evidentially grounded work of scholars whose names we'll learn tonight, is not a confident declaration. It is not a triumphant debunking, because the myth is not defeated by being examined. It is not a simple moral lesson, because the history is too complicated for simple moral lessons. It is not a warning, exactly, though there are things in it worth being warned by. The honest conclusion is something quieter than any of those things. It is this: Sparta was a real place, occupied by real people whose lives were as specific, as complicated, as resistant to reduction as every human life that has ever been lived anywhere. People who loved their children and feared their enemies and prayed to their gods and maintained their traditions under conditions of extraordinary structural constraint. All of them, the Spartiates and the Helots and the Perioikoi and the women whose names we occasionally have and the children whose names we almost never have, all of them were real, and the story that survived them was made almost entirely by other people, by people with their own needs, their own politics, their own appetites for a particular kind of heroism that the actual history was too complicated to provide, by people painting figures they had never seen, in cups they would drink from and set down, and perhaps never think about again, in rooms far from the valley where the thing they were painting had actually happened, in all its difficulty and its cost and its irreducible, specific, human truth. This is how myth works. This is how, if we are not careful, it works on us. And the best thing we can do, the only reliable defense against the myth's particular kind of power, is not to refuse the story. The story is beautiful. It has always been beautiful. That is the point. The best thing we can do is insist on the full story. The warrior and the helot, the sacrifice and the system, the crimson cloak and the bone signatures of people who worked until their bodies recorded the work permanently, the cup and the hands that could not make the journey. All of it held together without flinching in the same careful, honest, patient attention that the evidence deserves and that the people behind the evidence, the actual people, the ones who were actually there, have always deserved and have not, until very recently, and still only partially received. The kills of the Kylix went cold a long time ago. The workshops are gone. The clay pits are gone. The workshops that produced the bird bowls and the kylixes and the 10,000 other beautifully made objects that circulated through the Mediterranean world are gone, absorbed into the layered archaeology of a city that had been continuously occupied for 3,000 years, and that carries its past away all such cities do, incompletely, selectively, with great beauty in some places and great silence in others. The Eurotas is still moving, slowly, as it always has, the way rivers move in flat-bottomed valleys when the gradient is gentle and the banks are soft, and there is no particular urgency to the business of moving from the mountains to the sea. The oleanders are flowering, somewhere on the banks of Eurotas right now, in the particular pink that oleanders produce in the Mediterranean spring. The Laconian hound is running somewhere in the agricultural hinterland of the modern city, through terrain that knows nothing of the significance that human beings have been attaching to it for 25 centuries. The mountain is quiet. The pass at Thermopylae is wide. The museum in the modern city of Sparta has its objects in their cases with their handwritten labels, and the light in the galleries has the quality of a well-intentioned compromise, and the objects sit there patiently in that light, waiting for someone to come and look at them carefully enough to see what they actually are rather than what the myth has always said they should be. This is the work. It is quiet work. It does not announce itself. It does not have the emotional immediacy of the myth. It does not offer the clean story, the certain answer, the heroic last stand that simplifies a question of what courage looks like, and what sacrifice means, and what it feels like to belong to something larger than yourself. It offers something harder and more durable than any of those things. It offers a truth, or the closest approximation of the truth that the evidence will currently support, with the full acknowledgement that the evidence is incomplete and that our methods are imperfect and that the people who come after us will refine and correct and sometimes overturn what we have established, as we have refined and corrected and sometimes overturned what came before. It offers a conversation. The ongoing, unfinished, perpetually contested conversation between the human present and the human past, conducted across the silence of centuries, mediated by the fragmentary, biased, ideologically loaded, and yet irreplaceable materials that the past has left behind. It offers a cup in the light, fully seen. And it offers, finally, this. The questions that remain open are not a failure of the scholarship. They are the scholarship. The mystery is not the embarrassing residue left over after the real work of understanding is done. The mystery is the real work. The not knowing, the precise, carefully mapped, evidentially grounded not knowing of what the Helots called their children, of what songs were sung at Messenian weddings, of what it felt like to live inside the agoge as a 7-year-old who had left his family 4 days ago and would not see them again for years. This not knowing is not a gap in story. It is the story. The most important, the most human, the most honest part of it. The part that the myth was built, specifically and deliberately, to prevent you from noticing. Let the questions stay open. Let them rest here in the dark, where questions are most comfortable and most productive, not demanding resolution, not requiring answers before you're ready to give them, not insisting on a clean ending that the myth always provides and that the evidence never quite does. Let the valley be complicated. Let the river move slowly. Let the mountain be cold and ancient and indifferent to the significance that has been attached to it, and let that indifference be restful rather than alarming. The indifference of the physical world to human meaning is not a threat to meaning. It is a condition that makes meaning possible. The river does not know what happened in its valley, and so the river cannot lie about it. Only we can do that, and only we can choose not to. You have been listening for a long time now. Let the hands go soft. Let the jaw be easy. Let the breath do the only thing the breath needs to do, which is the same thing it has been doing without your assistance since the beginning. In and out, the most ancient rhythm there is, the one that preceded language and myth and the construction of elaborate fictions about people in distant valleys, the one that will continue long after the last cup is broken, and the last story is forgotten, and the river reaches the sea with no one left to watch it. The kills are cold, the valley is quiet, the cup is at the bottom of the past, where it has always rested, smooth and cool and heavier than you expect, carrying the image of man who was never quite what the painting said he was, in a place that was never quite what the story said it was. And that is enough. That is, in fact, exactly enough. The truth does not need to be simple to be restful. It only needs to be true. Sleep now. The past will be here in the morning. It always is.